I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Hey, fanfic family. So glad to see you here again to continue this incredible adventure. As always, kindly remember, this story is 100% fiction. So don't go looking for dimensional portals in your closet. All rights to this fantastic novel belong to the original author. We're just your humble narrators of epic tales. Are you enjoying the fanfic? Show it by subscribing to our YouTube channel and dropping us a like. And if you're impatient for more exclusive content, our Patreon is your happy place. Chapter 26 Operation Plan. Major Brownie cautiously peeked out from his trench, looking across the Marne. The 6th Army, under Galeri's command, was attacking the German flank, but it could no longer be called a German flank. By the time the 6th Army assembled, the Germans had turned their defenses in their direction, the former flank had become the front, and the Marne had become the flank. The German strategy was clearly correct. The Marne blocked the 5th Army's path, with only the Pont de la Marne available for passage. The Germans only needed to deploy a regiment of a few thousand men along the river, while the hundreds of thousands of French 5th Army soldiers could only watch from across the river. The battle plan is as follows. Major General Gard personally gave the order to Major Brownie's troops. General Gerlini will command the 6th Army to launch an attack on the enemy's flank. They will rush to the bridge of Marne and attack the northern bridgehead. Your tank units will cross the bridge of Marne as quickly as possible to coordinate with their attack and flank the enemy. Understand, General? Major Brownie immediately raised a question. The enemy has dug trenches and laid machine guns on the other side of the bridge. Our tanks may be trapped in the trenches and unable to move. Major General Gard looked at Brownie with an incredulous expression. Major, I did not order you to drive the tanks into the trenches. You only need to stop in front of the trenches to block the German bullets, and our troops can continuously attack the enemy from the bridgehead. Yes, General, Major Brownie responded. Although Major Brownie responded verbally, he had no confidence in this attack plan. He nervously peered through his binoculars, carefully observing the enemy's fortifications. On the north bank of the Marne, the Germans had constructed a circular position with at least 10 Maxim machine guns. Unlike the French Saint-Étienne machine gun, which would either overheat or malfunction due to its complex structure after firing 100 rounds, the Maxim machine gun would unleash a torrent of bullets at a rate of approximately 500 rounds per minute on the tanks. If the tanks, as Major General Gator had suggested, crossed the bridge and stopped before the trench, they would face machine gun fire from all sides. Even enemy artillery might have targeted the bridgehead, and the dense shelling would blast the tanks and their followers into the air. Could the tank's 9mm steel armor withstand the continuous barrage of Maxim fire? Could they withstand the bombardment of large-caliber artillery? Therefore, this operational plan was clearly unfeasible. Only a fool like Major General Gator would be so confident. The 6th Army launched its assault on the enemy lines amidst a cacophony of artillery fire. They were using the same old tactics. Soldiers, bayonets fixed, charged towards the enemy lines in dense formations, their bright red trousers clearly visible even in the smoke and fire of the artillery. They wore hoods to cover the red parts of their caps, but it was useless. German machine guns and rifles poured bullets down on them, and rows of French soldiers fell in neat heaps of blood. The soldiers were brave. They charged forward wave after wave through the hail of bullets, stepping over the mud and the bodies of their comrades, some even lying prone on the barbed wire to become bridges for their comrades. But it was all in vain. Bullets mercilessly claimed lives. An invisible wall seemed to stand before the enemy lines, stubbornly blocking the 6th Army's advance. Before this, Major Brownie might have thought this was acceptable. That's war. War inevitably involves death and sacrifice, all of it normal. However, after working with Charles, he couldn't help but doubt everything. Was this really meaningful? If the same thing can be done, or even victory achieved, with fewer casualties, is it necessary to do this? Major, someone couldn't help but say to Brownie, Major General Gard's battle plan will kill us. Yes, someone immediately echoed, it might just be a command error for him, but for us it's life, lost lives. Every life is precious to a soldier, but the generals don't care at all. They're unwilling to spend even a little time considering the rationality of their battle plan, only knowing to order soldiers to advance, attack, and kill the enemy. Major Brownie saw Major General Gard put away his binoculars. He seemed about to order an attack. That idiot. Major Brownie quickly crouched down and ran back along the trench. Major General Gard noticed Major Brownie's movements and angrily roared at him, Get back to your post, Major. We're about to attack. Major Brownie was the commander of the tank unit. Without him leading the charge, the attack couldn't proceed. Major Brownie pretended not to hear. He crouched down and ran to Major General Gator, saying, "General, now is not the time." Major General Gator's face darkened. "This is not your concern, General," Major Brownie explained. "Look across the way. The 6th Army's attack has been repelled. They are retreating and cannot form a pincer movement with us. We should wait for their next offensive." Major General Gator glanced across the way. This wave of attack was indeed nearing its end. The battlefield was littered with the corpses of French soldiers and the screams of the wounded. Survivors were risking their lives crawling back under machine gun fire. "Do what you're supposed to do," Major General Gator ordered sternly. "I know when to launch the attack." "Yes, General." Major Brownie knew that Major General Gator had accepted the advice. He was just being polite by not admitting it. On the way back, Major Brownie did not return to his position. He turned along the trench and ran quickly towards the town of Darvis in Major General Gator's blind spot. He ran faster and faster, bursting out of the trench and sprinting towards Charles's quarters at almost a 100-meter dash. The door was ajar and unlocked. Major Brownie pushed it open and rushed in. The room was empty, and Major Brownie's heart sank. They must have left, he thought. Just then, he heard a faint sound coming from the basement. He immediately understood what was happening and rushed down the stairs, banging on the door and shouting, "Charles, it's Brownie. I need to talk to you." "Open the door." Joko was startled by the voice. He hesitated. Was Major Brownie here to send Charles to the front lines to command tanks? But Joko opened the door anyway. After all, the Major had a gun, and opening the door would be easy. Major Brownie pushed the door open, panting, and asked, "Where is Charles? Is he here?" Joko's eyes flashed with wariness. "I won't allow you to take him to the battlefield. He's only 17, Major." Chapter 27 Infantry Tank Artillery Coordination. Major Brownie offered no explanation. He shoved Joko aside and rushed in. Seeing Charles, he seemed relieved. Looking around, he quickly walked to an old table and began drawing on the dusty surface with his finger, speaking urgently. "This is the river. This is the Marne Bridge. The enemy has positioned 10 heavy machine guns at the bridgehead in a circular formation. There's a circular trench in front of the formation, and possibly artillery behind." Major Brownie looked up at Charles, who was being shielded by Camille, his eyes urging, "What should we do? Can tanks withstand this kind of firepower?" Joko and Camille realized Major Brownie was only there to ask questions and relaxed their guard. Charles walked past Camille, looked at the dusty map under the light, and gave a crisp no. Although the Maxim machine gun used 7.92 mm rifle ammunition, its penetrating power was theoretically no different from a rifle. In a circular formation, the sides of the tanks would also be hit, and at close range, the tanks would be riddled with bullets. Even more serious is the artillery. To reduce weight, the tank's top armor uses only 2 mm steel plates, just a layer of iron. It can't possibly withstand artillery fire. No artillery can. "What should we do then?" Major Brownie asked anxiously. "How should we attack? Do you have a plan? Tell me quickly." "I don't have time. The next attack is about to begin." He wished he could just rip Charles's ideas out of his head and take them with him. Charles considered for a moment, then pointed to the map and replied, "Artillery cover, Major. Bombard the enemy bridgehead with artillery fire. The smoke and dust from the shells will obscure their vision, and the sound of the artillery will mask the tank's advance. The enemy won't know the tank's location. They won't even know the tanks have crossed a bridge. This might evade enemy machine guns." Major Brownie objected, "But what about enemy artillery fire?" Charles remained calm. "When our artillery is bombarding, enemy artillery fire is unlikely to join in. That would be a pointless waste of ammunition." Charles picked up a rock and placed it on the position as a tank, pushing it forward as he spoke, "So artillery fire can't stop. As the tanks advance, the artillery fire will extend, making the enemy think we're still indiscriminately bombarding." Brownie interrupted Charles, pointing to a line drawn on the map. "Trenches, Charles, you forgot about trenches, and battle trenches. Our tanks can only stay in front of the trenches. If they stay still, they'll eventually be discovered and blown to bits." "Who said that?" Charles replied, "You can order the soldiers to carry sandbags forward, and when they encounter a trench, they can fill it with sandbags to make a path for the tanks." Major Brownie's eyes widened, but he only hesitated for a moment before turning and running off, throwing back a shout, "You're a genius, Charles." "Thank you, you've saved us again." Djokovic and Camille exchanged glances. Camille, his face filled with disbelief, asked hesitantly, "Charles, were you just teaching them how to fight?" A major in the regular army didn't know how to fight this battle, but Charles did. Not only did he know, but he also came up with a solution in an instant. If Charles had previously trained French soldiers to cooperate with tanks because he was the inventor of the tank, this time it left Djokovic and Camille in disbelief. Where did Charles learn his military knowledge? Had he fought in battles or from books? What book would record a fighting method that even the French army didn't know? Could it really be as Major Brownie said, that Charles was a genius? Just as Joka and Camille were waiting for Charles's explanation, Charles jumped up as if pricked by a needle. His face was pale, his breathing rapid, and he muttered, Matthew, he's driving a tank." Charles was about to rush out when the quick-thinking Joka stopped him. "Let me go, father," Charles struggled. "I sent Matthew to the battlefield, the battle plan I devised." "No, Charles," Joka said, "whether you devised the battle plan or not, Matthew had to go to the battlefield. If your plan was feasible, then Matthew would have a chance to come back alive, otherwise, he would only die on the battlefield. So, what you did gave him a chance to come back alive." Charles slowly calmed down. He realized his father was right. This battle plan didn't put Matthew in danger on the battlefield, on the contrary, it reduced his mortality rate. "But," Charles said, "he still went to the battlefield." "This plan is very dangerous." Indeed, it was dangerous. Charles's battle plan was easier said than done. It required near-perfect coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery. Tanks had to advance behind artillery fire, a misfire, excessive tank speed, or failure of infantry to fill trenches in time could all lead to tragedy. It was easy to foresee that the French soldiers, untrained in coordination, would make mistakes, and ultimately only a portion of the tanks would successfully cross the Pont de la Marne. "You can't change anything, Charles," Joka retorted. "Can you stop this war?" Charles remained silent. This was reality. As long as the Germans were on the other side of the Marne, this battle had to be fought. And as long as there was war, tanks, these battlefield weapons, would inevitably be used, and Matthew, as an experienced driver, would inevitably be sent to the front lines. Camille gently put her arm around Charles's shoulder, comforting him. "Matthew will be all right, Charles. We will win this war, he will come back alive." On the south bank of the Marne, the fierce fighting subsided, and an eerie silence descended, like the darkness before dawn. Soldiers of the 3rd Battalion of the 9th French Infantry Regiment were digging mud and filling sandbags in the trenches. The tank crew was giving the tank a final check. The tractor, after being fitted with steel plates, was always prone to malfunctions, requiring a thorough inspection whenever possible, otherwise it might not be able to move. "I heard you're a friend of Master Charles." Machine gunner Eve was loading bullets onto the ammunition storage plate beside the tank. Matthew, under the tank's chassis, grunted in agreement. He tightened the last bolt on the tractor, then shuffled out like a caterpillar, wiping his hands with a rag as he stood up. "Yes, we grew up together, he's excellent." Machine gunner Eve nodded towards the tank. "He invented this thing, we're all alive because of him." Assistant gunner Nagi added, "I heard the major just went to see Master Charles, and we're operating according to his plan." "Really?" Matthew smiled. "This guy? I never knew he had this ability." Machine gunner Eve was somewhat surprised by Matthew's words. "You grew up with young Master Charles, didn't you know he had this ability?" "Of course I know." Matthew launched into his boasting mode. "I know everything he does, including when he's thinking about a certain woman." The soldiers busy nearby couldn't help but laugh. Someone stopped what they were doing and shouted over, "Hey, Matthew, do you think this battle plan will work?" "Don't worry," Matthew replied confidently. "I bet my life will win, you cunning fellow." Machine gunner Eve saw through Matthew's trick. "If we can't win, none of us will come back alive, and you're betting the cheapest thing, your life." "Then I'll bet a pack of chewing tobacco," Matthew said without batting an eye. He had excellent composure in this regard. Someone tossed something to Matthew, saying, "Here, you need this more than we do." Matthew picked it up and was overjoyed. It was a box of chewing tobacco he needed. He immediately opened it, reached out his dirty hands, pinched out a small pinch, and stuffed it into his mouth. Note: chewing tobacco is made from cigar tobacco scraps or finely chopped tobacco mixed with licorice, honey, etc. It is chewed to stay alert. Because it doesn't require lighting and doesn't produce smoke, it's suitable for use in special circumstances. During World War I, European armies were often issued it along with cigarettes. Just then, a series of rapid whistles rang out, and an officer shouted, "Get your spirits up. Prepare for battle." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 28: The Right Path. Matthew took out a crank and started the tractor. Amidst the rumble of the engine, he climbed into the tank to prepare for battle. The early tanks were quite awkward. The machine gunner was almost at the same level as the driver, who could only observe the front through a small observation port, about the size of a palm above his head. This was why some people had previously driven tanks into trenches and gotten stuck. Boom. Boom. The first sound was, as always, artillery fire. Unlike before, this time it wasn't just the 6th Army's artillery firing. The 5th Army's artillery was also bombarding the Germans. Outside, the artillery roared incessantly. Inside, the engine's rumble filled the air. With the thick steel plates blocking his view, Matthew couldn't hear anything else. After a few minutes, Matthew saw a signal flag wave in the distance through the observation port. It was a signal from the infantry. They had tied the signal flag to a long, curved pole so they could stand to the side and direct the tank to stop or advance. Matthew stepped on the accelerator and pulled the control lever. The tank rumbled and surged forward down the slope. After emerging from the bunker, Matthew was startled by what he saw. The area ahead was shrouded in a white cloud of smoke and dust, the Pont de la Marne completely obscured, its outline barely visible. Was this Charles's plan? Matthew cursed inwardly. Had this guy even considered the driver's visibility? If it weren't for his familiarity with the terrain, he wouldn't have been able to even get the tank onto the bridge. But Charles was right about one thing: the tank was perfectly safe amidst the artillery fire. Shells exploded almost right in front of Matthew, gradually advancing. Matthew carefully controlled his speed, following the shells. He could even hear the clanging of rubble hitting the steel plates. Then, to his horror, he saw a tank beside him blasted into a fireball by the artillery fire, still slowly moving forward. Matthew suddenly realized it wasn't just tanks. Many infantrymen might have been killed by the artillery fire, French artillery fire. Matthew's mind went blank, his breathing became rapid. He felt like he was sleepwalking on the edge of a cliff, only to wake up and realize how dangerous it was. The signal flags indicated that the tank would stop and start intermittently, sometimes moving smoothly and sometimes bumping along. Eve, crouching at the front, fired the machine gun. The already murky air inside the tank filled with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder, making it difficult for Matthew to breathe and further blurring his vision. Through the murmur of the gun, Matthew vaguely saw a Maxim machine gun lying askew on the trench and several German corpses, realizing then that the tank had crossed the German-dug trenches and even the trenches themselves. At this point, Matthew felt relieved. It meant there were no more obstacles to tether the tank. Matthew knew every inch of this terrain intimately. He knew where the roads were, where the hard ground was, where the muddy swamps would trap the tank, and he could even roughly guess where the enemy command post was. He felt like a fish out of water, freed. To test his theory, Matthew slammed on the accelerator, simultaneously turning the steering wheel, and the tank rumbled sharply, changing direction at a large angle. Machine gunner Eve turned to look at Matthew, his eyes filled with doubt. He shouted at the top of his lungs amidst the noise and artillery fire, "Are you off track, Matthew? Trust me," Matthew replied loudly, his tone full of confidence. "We're on the right track now." Cluck set up his command post between two hills on the north bank, accompanied by 5 M96 77mm field guns that had followed him. The reason for placing the command post and artillery here was due to the French army's superior artillery. While other French weapons might not be up to par, the 75mm field gun was remarkably efficient. It was equipped with a hydraulic recoil mechanism, achieving a maximum rate of fire of an astonishing 30 rounds per minute. Ironically, this mechanism was invented by the Germans, but Krupp refused to use it, forcing the inventor to sell the patent to France. With a significant disadvantage in both the number and rate of fire of their artillery, Cluck had no choice but to position his command post and artillery within the enemy's blind spots. Another advantage of this was that the artillery could block the bridgehead, preventing the enemy armored monsters and infantry from crossing the Pont de la Marne. "Artillery, prepare," Kluck ordered, and the well-trained artillerymen immediately loaded shells and prepared to fire. The French artillery was bombarding the bridgehead, and Kluck believed that the armored monsters who had defeated the 1st Regiment would soon appear there, and he would blast them into the air. Suddenly, Kluck vaguely saw a dark shape through his binoculars. The shape was indistinct, only flashing briefly in the smoke and dust as the flames from the artillery fire subsided. Kluck was startled. He recognized them as the French armored monsters. They weren't about to cross the bridge, they had already crossed, under the cover of the smoke and fire. "Those bastards!" Kluck turned and ordered the artillery, "Fire! Fire now!" Boom! Boom! The cannons fired shells one after another, followed by another wave. Kluck raised his binoculars and looked towards the bridgehead, realizing with horror that it was too late. The armored monsters had already crossed the artillery's marked range, and all the shells were hitting their rear. How did they cross the trenches and ravines? Kluck was baffled. In the previous battle, these creatures had clearly been unable to cross the trenches, yet now they moved as if on flat ground. No one answered him, because no one knew the answer. The German soldiers guarding the front lines were once again frightened back by the armored monsters, while the French army, led by the monsters, plunged into the German flank like a sharp knife. "Aim at those guys," Kluck anxiously ordered the artillery. However, field artillery was not easy to fire at moving targets. They relied more on the sheer number of shells to cover an area. The enemy's armored monsters dispersed after crossing the bridgehead, leaving the Germans' limited 5 guns disoriented and unsure of which target to engage. The seasoned veteran Kluck remained calm under pressure. After a moment's consideration, he issued 2 orders: Guard Battalion, organize defenses at the valley entrance; artillery, concentrate your fire on the area 200 meters ahead of the valley entrance. The valley entrance was between 2 hills, narrowing to only 30-odd feet at its narrowest point. Once the armored monster entered, it would be inevitably bombarded. Just as the Guard Battalion and artillery were preparing for battle, a rattling sound suddenly came from the ridge path to their side. Then, an armored monster appeared behind the defensive line. It paused for a moment to everyone's astonishment, then swiftly swooped down the ridge slope, accompanied by a faint shout of "Yo-ho!" The tank charged forward, spewing fire wildly, instantly killing more than a dozen artillerymen. The other artillerymen turned tail and ran. They didn't want to stay and wait to die. How could human flesh possibly fight against this armored monster? Startled by this sudden turn of events, the Guard Battalion hastily withdrew from the defensive line to protect Kluck. "General," the battalion commander suggested, "retreat. We can't hold this position." What he really meant was, if you don't leave now, you'll become the highest-ranking commander in our army to be captured or killed in action. Chapter 29: The Power of Money. Fortunately, France won, and Charles's operational plan succeeded. The Fifth Army penetrated the weak flank of the German forces through the Bridge of Marne, causing the First Army to collapse completely before reinforcements arrived. Unfortunately, Matthew was wounded, as Major Brownie told Charles. "Matthew was very brave," Major Brownie said. He drove his tank around the enemy lines via a side road and charged into the German command post. This first domino toppled the Germans, causing a rout and expanding the victory. "How badly is he wounded?" Charles asked anxiously. He was more concerned about this than the victory. "I'm not sure," Major Brownie replied. "I only heard that he was wounded in the right leg. The bullet pierced the steel plate from the side and hit his right leg where he was pressing the accelerator. He was taken to a field hospital before I knew the details." "Where's the field hospital?" Charles asked again, feeling a chill on his face. 2 kilometers towards Thierry," Major Brownie replied. "The Fifth Army's wounded are all being sent there." Djokovic, already walking towards his ford, turned back slightly and waved to Charles. "Come on, let's go there." The field hospital was essentially a cluster of tents, pitched on the grass, meant to shelter the wounded from the wind and rain. But the tents were far from enough to hold the wounded, who were haphazardly laid out on the ground awaiting medical attention, some shot in the abdomen, some with blown-off limbs, some with bandages on their heads, unconscious. They were divided into several sections: the lightly wounded section, the seriously wounded section, and the untreatable section. The untreatable section was unattended. They were a group of abandoned wounded who could only wait to die there. The seriously wounded section was right next to it, to facilitate the transfer of some of them to the untreatable section. Screams and wails rose and fell, the air thick with a stench of carbolic acid, pus, and blood. Flies buzzed and swarmed everywhere. Occasionally, a few nurses would emerge from the tents carrying buckets filled with severed limbs, which they expertly dump into a nearby pit. Charles felt a churning in his stomach and nearly vomited, while the nurses remained indifferent, their eyes numb, as if they were already used to it all. Djoka asked several people before finally finding Matthew's location, a single tent containing a simple wooden bed. Matthew lay on it, covered with a blood-stained blanket, while Joseph sat at the head of the bed, head slumped, tears welling in his eyes. Matthew's face was pale, streaked with blood, and his once flowing hair was matted with blood clots. Matthew forced a smile as soon as he saw Charles, pretending nothing was wrong, and called out, "Hey, Charles, great plan. It helped us win this war." His voice was weak, and at the end it even trembled uncontrollably. Charles knew he was enduring pain. Charles ignored him and went straight to Joseph. "How is he?" Joseph's eyes were somewhat panicked. "Nothing serious. The doctor said he needs to rest for a while." However, Djoka and Charles could both see that this wasn't the case. Joseph led Charles and Djoka outside the tent before telling the truth. "They amputated his leg. His right leg is gone." "What?" Charles stared at Joseph in shock. "He was only brought in recently. They had to make a diagnosis and perform surgery as quickly as possible." Joseph replied. Charles understood. It was because there were too many wounded to treat, and the doctors had to race against time to treat the injuries, even if some didn't require amputation. It wasn't hard to imagine that if doctors spent too much time performing major surgery on a single wounded soldier, more wounded soldiers might die without treatment. To avoid such situations, doctors would choose amputation for any serious injury. Note, during World War I, 20,000 out of every 500,000 wounded soldiers underwent amputations, many of which were not necessary. Charles couldn't blame the field doctors. They had their reasons, and they were justified. But he felt a pressure in his chest that he couldn't release. Charles returned to the tent, lifted a corner of the blanket, and was shocked to find that the bandage binding Matthew's severed leg was an old bandage that had been used and was still stained with blood. Charles could no longer contain himself. He stumbled out of the tent, shouting in a questioning tone, "Doctor! Where's the doctor?" A doctor in a white coat and mask hurried out of a tent a dozen feet away. He half-raised his blood-stained hands and asked in a tired but indifferent voice, "What happened? Does anyone need emergency care?" Charles angrily ran up to him, pointing towards Matthew's tent, and said, "The patient lying there is a war hero. He drove a tank into the enemy command post and won this victory for France, and you're using old bandages on him? Are you trying to kill him? Is this how you treat heroes?" The doctor in the white coat calmly glanced at Charles and replied, "Everyone here is a hero, including us. If you have any complaints, go yell at those capitalists. They haven't given us enough medicine and equipment, and they don't have enough manpower. We lack everything here. What can we do?" Charles was stunned. The doctor in the white coat was right. This wasn't their fault. It was the capitalists who committed these crimes to save money. Field hospitals are an unprofitable, or rather, money-losing, business. They're practically useless when there's no war, but their demand skyrockets during conflict. Capitalists can't afford to maintain field hospitals at such a scale in peacetime. Their existence is merely to provide some psychological comfort to French soldiers to get them into battle. Yet, these are people, vibrant lives, warriors sacrificing themselves to defend France. Charles, his face pale with anger, said, "Put it on my tab. Tell me what you need, and I'll provide the funds." The man in the white coat chuckled and turned to leave, complaining to nurse beside him, "Where did this kid come from? He actually thinks he can afford the costs of a field hospital. Doesn't he know there are at least tens of thousands of wounded here?" The nurse slowed her pace. "Dr. Hebrew, I know him. He's young Master Charles. He's the one who invented the tank and saved France. I believe he can afford the costs here." The man in the white coat suddenly stopped, paused for a moment, then abruptly turned and ran back to the bewildered Charles, his voice trembling with excitement. You're serious? Young Master Charles, you'll provide us with funds?" "Of course." Charles nodded. "That's wonderful." The man in the white coat wanted to shake hands with Charles, but then realized his hands were covered in blood and quickly withdrew. "Thank you on behalf of the wounded, young Master Charles." The man in the white coat stammered. "You saved their lives. You're a good man, young Master Charles, including Matthew," Charles emphasized. "I hope Matthew is being well taken care of." "Of course," the man in the white coat replied. "I'll go check on him right away." He then led the nurse towards Matthew's tent. This is the power of money. Although it wasn't fair to the other wounded, Charles couldn't care less at this moment. Chapter 30 The Will of the People. They changed Matthew's bandages, gave him an injection of morphine, and assigned a nurse to be on call at any time. In return, Dr. Hebrew gave Charles a long list of supplies and personnel needed for the field hospital. Supplies included tents, beds, blankets, bandages, medical cotton, tourniquets, styptic powder, morphine, etc. Personnel included doctors and nurses, cleaners, personal care workers, cooks, helpers. Looking at this list, Charles finally understood why the field hospital had collapsed. They were practically working on a 100-pound weight. Charles assigned Joseph to go to Paris to purchase supplies, while Djoka volunteered to organize the personnel. Although Joseph was reluctant to leave Matthew's side, he readily agreed, knowing that these supplies were also urgently needed by Matthew. "Don't worry, Master Charles," Joseph said, "I will definitely bring back all these supplies, nothing will be missing." Djoka wrote Joseph a check for 100,000 francs, instructing, "You can take my car, and ask me for more money if you need more." "Thank you, Mr. Djoka, thank you very much." Joseph accepted the check with both hands, his eyes filled with gratitude. He gently removed his hat to greet Djoka and Charles, and then gently patted Matthew's pale hand on the hospital bed. "Don't worry, Father," Matthew comforted him, "I'll be fine, Charles is with me." Joseph nodded, then led the two men toward the ford. "Wait," Djoka chased after them from behind, "take me to town first, I'll go there to find some men." When only Matthew and Charles remained in the tent, Matthew finally sighed, his smile vanishing instantly, replaced by paleness and helplessness. "I know they cut off my leg, Charles." Only in front of Charles could Matthew completely let down his guard. Charles was somewhat surprised. Joseph had been keeping this from Matthew, worried that Matthew wouldn't be able to accept the reality. Matthew smiled slightly. "Of course I know, Charles, that's my leg. I can't feel it anymore." "So, you were faking it?" Charles asked, "to put your father's mind at ease." Matthew didn't answer, his eyes empty and tinged with desolation. "Sometimes I think, would it be better if I died on the battlefield? Is that what you think?" Charles glared angrily at Matthew. "You were defeated so easily." Matthew smiled bitterly, his gaze towards Charles filled with contempt. "You capitalists will never understand us poor people. Do you know what they used to exchange for my leg? 130 francs. Charles, they bought my leg for 130 francs. Matthew was referring to the compensation. France gave 260 francs to fallen soldiers, half that for the wounded. What can 130 francs do? Matthew continued. If we save every penny, it might last 2 years, but what about after that? Charles then realized that Matthew was calculating the economics. He was considering the livelihood of his father and family. From that perspective, death was indeed better than disability. Death meant more money and no after effects, while disability not only meant less money but also many subsequent troubles. Matthew, no. Matthew stopped Charles from continuing with an angry glare. I don't need it, Charles. He seemed to guess what Charles was going to say. Come on, Matthew, come to my factory, I'll give you a job. He didn't need anyone's pity, even if it was Charles. Charles didn't say that. He moved a stool and sat on the edge of Matthew's bed, saying expressionlessly, I won't pity you, Matthew. I despise you. What? Matthew couldn't believe what he was hearing. Charles told Matthew the truth. I asked Dr. Hebrew. Your leg didn't originally need to be amputated. It was because of a shortage of manpower that they had to do it so they could have time to save others. What? Matthew stared at Charles in disbelief. They amputated my leg just because of this. For the doctors, it might save a little time, but for Matthew, it was a lifetime. Charles ignored Matthew's expression and continued, Do you know who ruined you like this? It's those capitalists who wouldn't spend money on field hospitals. If there were just a few more doctors, a few more medicines, or a few more people, your leg might not be like this. Charles raised his voice. They ruined your life, and all you think about is how to live off 130 francs. You want me to pity you, to sympathize with you? No, Matthew. I despise you. They defeated you easily, completely. Matthew gritted his teeth, cold sweat beading on his forehead. But what can I do? Stand up. Charles interrupted Matthew, his tone firm. Fight them, settle accounts with them, make them pay. Matthew gasped for breath, the blanket on his chest heaving with his rapid breathing, large beads of sweat streaming down his pale face. He looked to be in great pain, But his previously lifeless eyes gradually began to flicker with light, at first just a few sparks, but soon growing brighter and brighter. Sensing the movement behind him, Charles turned around in confusion and found that a large number of nurses and wounded soldiers had gathered outside the tent, including Dr. Hebrew. The tent offered no soundproofing, and Charles's words had already reached the surrounding area and spread among the wounded. Ignoring their pain, they stood up and gathered around Charles. "Young Master Charles is right. They can't treat us like this. They send us to the battlefield but refuse to give us even the most basic medical care. They're still enjoying life. They're indulging in pleasure under our protection with the money they've earned by exploiting us. We've had enough. Young Master Charles, lead us to settle accounts with those capitalists." "Yes, you're a capitalist with a conscience. We're willing to follow you." Charles was startled by their reaction. His earlier words were more intended to incite Matthew's fighting spirit, but he hadn't expected the wounded to be so easily provoked into organizing and rebelling against the capitalists. This was a riot, and the capitalists would immediately mobilize troops to suppress it. Such things were common during this period. With their strength, doing so was practically suicide. Charles quickly waved his hand and said, "Listen to me, gentlemen. The most important thing now is to recover from our injuries. Only when we are strong can we continue to fight the enemy. We cannot be hasty, otherwise we will only hurt ourselves." The wounded soldiers fell silent. They knew Charles was right. However, they would soon be homeless and starving to death due to poverty. What kind of struggle could they possibly have? Charles seemed to see through their thoughts and then added, "I happen to have bought a motorcycle factory. Most of the workers have already left. If you are willing, you can work in my factory in the future." The wounded soldiers were surprised and delighted, but also worried. "But many of us are missing limbs." "Don't worry," Charles said, "I will find you suitable jobs. Believe me, you are heroes of France and should not be treated like this." The wounded soldiers cheered. They paid tribute to Charles with tears in their eyes and despite their pain. In their eyes, young Master Charles was simply a savior. This included Matthew, and the doctors and nurses were also moved to tears. Only Charles knew that he did this not only for Matthew, nor only for the wounded. No one understood the importance of winning people's hearts better than Charles. It was key to fighting against capitalists. And the cheapest and most effective way to win people's hearts was to offer help in times of need, not to add to someone's existing success. Chapter 31 Poaching. Supplies arrived at a field hospital in batches from Paris. The first group of personnel also arrived from the town. Djoka led them on foot to the field hospital. The group included men and women, young and old, including Camille. Perhaps because of the trust of her neighbors, Camille naturally became the leader of the young women. Their task was to learn bandaging and dressing changes from the nurses to supplement a shortage of medical staff. They had to replace all the old bandages on the wounded with new ones, changing them daily thereafter, and also washing, disinfecting, and drying the used bandages, an astonishing workload. The older women, due to their slower learning abilities, were assigned to take care of the wounded's daily needs, while the younger men naturally did the physical labor. "They're all volunteers," Joka said to Charles. "I told them you'd pay them 1 franc a day, but they refused. They said it was what they should do, it was for France, for their children, and it wasn't just for Master Charles." Joka looked at the busy neighbors and sighed. "They are such kind people." Charles hummed in agreement and turned to Joka, asking, "Do you object to me doing this, Father?" Joka smiled. "No, Charles. Your mother and I have never been so proud of you. Look at her." As he spoke, Joka turned his gaze to Camille in the crowd. Camille had just finished bandaging a wounded soldier. Sensing Joka and Charles's gaze, she quickly waved in their direction, then turned to change the bandages of another wounded soldier, her face always smiling as she gently inquired about the injuries. "I was a little worried about you before, Charles." Joka looked at Charles, his tone relaxed. "I was worried you'd become like Francis, but now I'm relieved." Of course he wouldn't, Joka thought. He spent the money he earned from capitalists generously on those in need. How could he possibly be like those heartless capitalists? Charles knew Joka had misunderstood. If Joka and Camille knew his true intentions, would they be disappointed? But it seemed to make no difference, because Charles was genuinely doing good. Thinking of this, Charles felt at ease. Charles's actions were very successful. The most obvious example is that almost every wounded soldier lying on the operating table asks, "Doctor, can you save my hand? If not, just one. I hope to work for Master Seal in the future." The doctors always reassure him, Don't worry, we have enough manpower and supplies now. We will do our best. Once, Sil was genuinely startled. While walking down the street, he was suddenly embraced by a ragged old woman who was sobbing uncontrollably, her whole body trembling with grief. Sil was too afraid to move. He thought he had encountered a mad woman, and that she might be holding a kitchen knife. After a long while, the old woman stopped crying and bent down, her wrinkled face filled with kindness and affection. She placed an egg in Charles's hand, holding it tightly, her voice trembling. "Child, if Axel had met a capitalist like you sooner, he wouldn't have died alone." Charles learned from others that Axel was her grandson, only 2 years older than him, who had been wounded in the Battle of Muros and brought back more than half a month earlier. When his family arrived at the hospital, they found him already dead, a rag stuffed into his blood-soaked abdominal wound, a dishcloth. No one could imagine how desperate, helpless, or even angry he had been before his death, anger towards the country. This was just the tip of the iceberg. There were many more legends about Charles, many of which Charles had never done or even known about. Charles's reputation soon reached Paris. People buying medicine and supplies would bring Charles's story to Paris, and drivers transporting supplies would report the situation at the field hospital back. When Francis learned of this, he was quite surprised. He scoffed, "That fool. I thought he was different from Joka, but it turns out they're the same kind of people." Then he added, "He's a maid's son after all. I'll wait until he goes bankrupt because of this." At this moment, Francis didn't know that it wasn't Charles who was going bankrupt, but him. This was precisely the first step in Charles's plan. With popular support, Charles confidently began to undermine Francis's workforce. The Holt 75 was more advanced than the Holt 60, but they were produced by the same company, with the former being an upgraded version of the latter. Inevitably, they shared many similarities in technology and components. Charles's difficulty in producing the Holt 75 tractor wasn't funding. He had enough to import. Nor was it technology. The British, eager to capture the French market, would be very willing to license production and provide the technology. The real challenge was finding skilled technicians and engineers. These were people who had learned and passed down their skills generation after generation in the factory over decades. Much of what they possessed couldn't be bought with money. Charles set his sights on Joseph. Joseph had been in charge of production at the Francis tractor factory for many years, and no one knew better than him which workers possessed genuine skills and expertise. Lately, because of Matthew's injury, Joseph had been rushing to the field hospital after work, losing weight from the constant activity. That day, after finishing his work at the factory, Joseph once again arrived at the field hospital before dark, where Charles stopped him at the entrance. "We'll take care of Matthew, Joseph," Charles said. "He's recovering well. You need to worry about your own health." "I know." Severely exhausted, Joseph sat down on the grass, weakly replying, "Thank you, Master Charles. But I just can't control myself. I can only sleep peacefully when I see him," referring to Matthew. "Even if I'm just sitting in a chair." Charles sat down beside Joseph, bending his legs, and said thoughtfully, "I'm thinking about something, Joseph. You know about my relationship with Mr. Francis?" "Yes, of course," Joseph nodded. "Francis and I don't get along. We're sworn enemies and will become rivals in the future," Charles said thoughtfully. "And you work for Francis, while Matthew will work for me in the future, so you and Matthew, that won't matter, Master Charles," Joseph said. "If you can give Matthew a job, it's no big deal if I choose to retire." It wasn't about the salary. Joseph's monthly salary was 53 francs, almost twice that of an ordinary worker. It was obviously not worthwhile to use his retirement to keep Matthew's job. But Joseph knew that it wasn't about the amount of money, but about psychology. If Matthew didn't get a job, he would feel like a useless person, like he had been eliminated by society, and he would eventually be completely defeated after being idle. Therefore, Joseph would rather give up his own job to give Matthew a job. "I can find other jobs," Joseph thought. "It's just a pity that Master Charles bought a motorcycle factory, otherwise it would be perfect." Charles nodded and said, "I plan to import the Holt 75 tractor from England and open a tractor factory." "What do you think?" Joseph was stunned. He said excitedly, This is wonderful, young Master Charles. Although it's a bit embarrassing to say, but, can I recommend myself?" "Of course." Charles smiled and extended his hand to Joseph. "Congratulations on joining us, Joseph. You are now the head of Charles' tractor factory, with a monthly salary of 60 francs. I plan to send you to England to import this tractor. Is that alright? Importing tractors requires taking a group of technicians and skilled workers to inspect and learn, and also overseeing the process in England before confidently importing the production line. Joseph must recruit some of the most important talent from Francis to complete this task. Joseph blinked and hesitated before asking, then, young Master Charles, can I bring a group of people with me? Chapter 32 Rifles or Tanks? The imposing chamber of the Palais Bourbon in France was bustling with activity. Semicircular seats surrounded the speaker's bench, with a 5-foot-wide aisle running through the center, dividing the seating into clearly defined left and right sections. The left side sat on the left, the right side on the right. Grevy and Armand, the leaders of the two right-wing parties, sat in the front row on the right, listening to the commotion from both sides while conversing in hushed tones. After a while, Grevy glanced aggressively at the left side, then turned to Armand. It's time to deliver a heavy blow. Armand nodded, straightened his tie, and, leaning on his cane, strode confidently to the podium. The French Chamber of Deputies stage had two levels. The lower level was for members to speak and raise issues, while the higher level housed the speaker and other government officials. Armand glanced around, paused for a moment, then gracefully raised his right hand and placed it flat in front of his abdomen, delivering a powerful shout. Gentlemen, his voice was high-pitched and penetrating. Even the members in the last row could clearly hear every word he spoke. The initial clamor gradually subsided, and both sides returned to their seats, turning their attention to Armand on the stage. This was one of the reasons why Grevy consistently allied with Armand against the left wing. Armand had few redeeming qualities, but as a lawyer, he was eloquent, sharp-tongued, and highly persuasive, precisely what Grevy lacked. First, Armand waved casually to the audience. Please allow me to express my deepest apologies to the Germans. This time, they will not be crowned in Paris. A knowing laugh rippled through the hall. A very good start, Grevy thought to himself. Neither the left nor the right wing would reject a French victory. Then Armand added, unless they're willing to send the Kaiser over. The laughter grew louder, punctuated by a few scattered claps. I will prepare a very special coronation ceremony for the Kaiser, Armand continued. This ceremony will have a wooden frame, a rope, and I will personally place the crown around his neck. He then mimicked a hanging gesture, making an exaggerated face and sticking out his tongue. The hall erupted in laughter, followed by thunderous applause. Grevy was utterly impressed by Armand's oratory genius. His every gesture effortlessly drew attention to him. Only in this way could his subsequent words resonate with the audience. Armand got to the point. For decades, France has been in a state of defeat against Germany, both psychologically and practically, so much so that girls in brothels named Alsace are particularly sought after. They hope to take Alsace back from the Germans and bring it under their control through this method. Note, during the Franco-Prussian War, France ceded Alsace and Lorraine. Coincidentally, many French women share the name Alsace, and some women in brothels intentionally changed their names to Alsace. The members of parliament reacted differently to this. Some laughed, some looked embarrassed, some of them had done such things themselves. This is nothing shameful, Armand continued. It should be something to be proud of, because it is precisely a manifestation of your love for this country, and I am proud of it. The embarrassed ones felt a little more comfortable. Armand spoke faster. What I really want to say is that from now on, your wishes may very well come true, not in brothels, but on the battlefield. We are leading the French army to true conquest of Alsace. Yes, many responded loudly. And Lorraine, and reparations, Armand emphasized. That's right, the crowd roared. And to make the Germans bow their noble heads, Armand shouted, raising his fist. That's right, the members of parliament echoed, the fervor reaching its peak. Then Armand changed the subject, his voice softening. However, we should consider a question. What helped us defeat the Germans? The members of parliament were bewildered. Wasn't it obvious? Wasn't it the French army? Having piqued their curiosity, Armand revealed the answer. Gentlemen, a young man named Charles provided the answer, the tank. The members of parliament nodded in agreement. Of course, they knew this. A young man named Charles had invented the tank, and the French army, with the help of tanks, had defeated the Germans. Grevy stood up at the opportune moment and shouted, that's right. Tanks played a crucial role in both battles of Darvest. Without tanks, we couldn't have won. Led by Grevy, right-wing members of parliament echoed his sentiments, while left-wing members could only nod in agreement. After all, it was a fact. The left wing was completely unaware that they were falling into a trap set by Grevy and Armand. Armand continued, the tanks appeared suddenly when the French army was in retreat, turning the tide of the battle and leading the already routed French to victory. Then, they successfully routed the German army in the counter-offensive on the Marne. You must know that this battle was commanded by General Gallieri, who led the 6th Army in a fierce attack on the Germans, but suffered heavy casualties and achieved nothing, even risking collapse. What Armand said was true. This was the German operational plan. They were waiting for the 6th Army's next offensive. Once the 6th Army's attack failed, they would immediately launch a counter-offensive. Because the 6th Army had lost manpower and morale, it would be difficult for it to withstand the German counter-offensive. Note, historically, the 6th Army was indeed defeated by the Germans. It was only after Joffre personally persuaded a British expeditionary force to join the battle that the Germans were finally defeated. Although the overall combat strength of the British Army was a mess, the first batch of hundreds of thousands of expeditionary troops sent to France were elite troops with rich combat experience. Armand posed the key question, so, gentlemen, tell me, in the upcoming battles, do you want to deploy more rifles, machine guns, artillery, or tanks? Do you want the French army to suffer heavy casualties like the 6th Army but be unable to defeat the enemy, or like the 5th Army, to be able to rout the German army with only a few hundred men? The answer to this question was obvious. Almost everyone shouted, tanks, we need tanks, to hell with rifles. In the past, no matter what the topic, the left and right wings would always argue fiercely because of their different positions. But on this issue, they were surprisingly united. Almost everyone supported tanks. Only one person watched all this in silence. He was Steed, the owner of the Saint Etienne arsenal. Almost all of the French army's light weapons, including standard rifles and machine guns, were produced by the Saint Etienne arsenal. Steed had just received news that the two right-wing parties had joined forces to purchase the tank patent. Therefore, he knew perfectly well what Armand's impassioned speech was all about. At that moment, Armand's gaze met Steed's. Looking at the unperturbed Steed, Armand's lips curled into a defiant smile, as if to say, what can you do to me? Bring it on. Chapter 33 Smart Approach. At Armand estate, Grevy poured a bottle of champagne amidst cheers, while Francis basked in the glory of victory. A brilliant speech, Armand. Grevy complimented Armand sincerely as he poured him a drink. Armand smiled and replied, I'd rather see Steed's face than his speech. Did you see it? He couldn't do anything, just sat there dumbfounded. I saw it. Nicola raised his glass. I was sitting not far from him, and he was like a statue, completely stunned. Several people burst into laughter. Francis smiled awkwardly, his expression slightly embarrassed. He was the only one absent and had no idea what was happening. After a moment's hesitation, Francis mustered his courage and asked, So, we won, right? Of course, Francis, Armand replied triumphantly, we got a huge order in our first batch. 1,500 tanks, at 5,000 francs each, Grevy grunted, interrupting Armand and giving him a wink. This idiot, Francis didn't need to know this. Armand smiled indifferently. In his opinion, Grevy's reaction was a bit excessive. Even if Francis knew, what difference would it make? He was just a farmer who made his fortune with tractors. Francis's eyes widened in astonishment. He knew what had happened. They sold the tanks for 5,000 francs each. But they only received them for 1,360 francs each, including a machine gun. The difference multiplied by 1,500 tanks. God, they could earn over 5 million francs from just this one batch. Charles only made 1.1 million francs from selling the patent, and he himself only made a pittance. These dirty capitalists, despicable bloodsuckers, parasites on the state, this is how they plunder our taxes. Is there a problem? Armand asked, raising an eyebrow when he saw Francis's expression. No problem. Francis quickly put on a smile and raised his glass. Gentlemen, to our victory. But the others did not respond. Armand said expressionlessly, it's too early to celebrate victory now, Mr. Francis. We can say that when we receive the money. You are right, Mr. Armand. Francis awkwardly withdrew his glass. After a moment of silence, Nicholas asked, so, what should we write now? Nicholas's full name was Nicolas Kocher, and he was the owner of Le Figaro. Unlike Le Petit Journal, Le Figaro was a newspaper aimed at the nobility and upper class. A single copy cost 1 franc, a price unaffordable for ordinary people. Therefore, Le Figaro also possessed aristocratic characteristics. It disdained contact with commoners, typically reporting on national affairs and debates among members of parliament. Furthermore, its information and intelligence often differed significantly from the facts, as it was detached from the common people. For example, before the Franco-German War, Le Figaro believed France could easily win the war, repeating its past glory of sweeping Germany 14 times, and thus encouraged readers to continue enjoying brandy and cigars while awaiting victory. The result was victory. Nicholas, Grevy said, you only need to report the victory of the tank, make everyone go crazy for tanks, and everyone know its inventor, Charles. Then, we can wait for wealth to roll in. Armand was somewhat puzzled. Won't you report our patents for tanks? No, Grevy replied, now is not the time. I hope Steed will copy it. Armand was stunned for a moment, then understood. Grevy hoped to mislead Steed into believing the patent was still in Charles's hands. Once Steed copied or circumvented the tank patent, the right wing could slap Steed in the face with a patent they held, then use media and legal means to seize the moral high ground and deliver a crushing blow, even demanding compensation. A smart move, Armand affirmed Grevy, and the clinking of their glasses echoed. When Francis returned to his villa, he was still resentful. Why could those arrogant fools earn millions with just a few words, while he, having done everything, only earned a few 100,000 francs? But anger aside, business had to be done, otherwise, he wouldn't even earn those few 100,000 francs. Francis comforted himself, these were extraordinary times, money wasn't so easy to earn. So many factories had gone bankrupt because of the war, he not only survived but also made a profit, he should be content. Simon, Francis summoned the butler. Summon Joseph. Master, the butler replied, Joseph has resigned. Resigned? Francis frowned. Yes, the butler replied, I think it's because of his son. His son lost a leg on the battlefield and needs someone to take care of him. Francis grunted in agreement, not taking it to heart. Then call Thomas here. The butler was taken aback. Thomas seems to have resigned as well. In the few days you've been in Paris, over 70 people have resigned. I have the list in your study. Thomas should be one of them, but I'm not entirely sure. Francis sensed something unusual and pressed on. Where did they go? Why are so many people resigning? Even when rumors circulated that the Germans were about to invade, they hadn't resigned, yet they chose to resign now. This question stumped Simon, and he could only give an unconfirmed answer. It said that they were terrified by seeing so many soldiers killed and wounded. They're worried about receiving conscription orders in the near future, so they plan to go to England to find work, so they can. Francis nodded. This explanation made sense. Indeed, more and more people were receiving conscription orders, causing widespread anxiety. Going to England to work might not be an escape, but at least the French government wouldn't know where they were and couldn't deliver conscription orders to them in the short term. Then Francis laughed. These fools, didn't they realize we were going to switch to tank production? As a factory providing vital equipment to the army, they won't receive conscription orders. The butler sighed. If they were smarter, or had resigned later, they wouldn't have to suffer like this. It's their loss, sir. Francis quickly forgot about it. After all, the tractor factory had over 2,000 employees, and it could function just as well without those 70-odd people, especially since he needed to focus on tank production. What Francis didn't realize was that this was exactly what Charles wanted. What the butler knew was that Charles had intentionally spread rumors in the factory through Joseph. Charles didn't want Francis to discover his plan too early and prepare accordingly. Chapter 34 You are young, Master Seal? That day, Charles accompanied Joka to the motorcycle factory. Joka had reminded Charles of this. Our expenses are huge, Charles. Joka waved a ledger at Charles. The motorcycle factory cost 350,000 francs. The first payment for the tractor production line in England was 200,000 francs, and we're not even sure if that will be enough. The field hospital costs about 18,000 francs a day on average, and that's with volunteers not getting paid. The motorcycles need more funding to get back into operation. At this rate, we'll be bankrupt soon, Charles sighed inwardly. Money really flies. Although 990,000 francs was a huge sum, if he wanted to cultivate a conscientious capitalist image to win people over, the money had to flow out like a river. The expense seemed small, only 18,000 francs a day, but it was a long-term commitment, while his assets weren't increasing, so he was just living off his savings. Don't worry, father, Charles said. I heard the motorcycle factory has a lot of unsold inventory. We can sell some first. There is indeed inventory. Dayoka looked at Charles with uncertainty. The problem is, who would buy motorcycles now? Charles didn't explain further. He planned to go to the motorcycle factory first. The motorcycle factory was next to Francis's tractor factory. It wasn't as large as the tractor factory, and before the war, it had more than 800 workers, making it a medium-sized enterprise. However, its area was huge, totaling 32 acres, twice the size of the tractor factory. So much so that it took Dayoka's car quite a while to reach the factory area after entering the gate. One reason the motorcycle factory needed such a large space was that during this period, selling motorcycles required training. To do this, there needed to be enough space for multiple buyers to learn at the same time, and even various terrains. Dayoka parked his car near the warehouse. As they got out of the car, Joka said, "I think Paul is the right person to manage the motorcycle factory. He's very sociable, and he only suffered minor injuries. Your mother and I both think he's a very good young man. His social skills might bring in more sales for the motorcycle factory." Paul was a wounded soldier who had helped many wounded soldiers with volunteers in the field hospital and had earned a good reputation. "No, father." Charles walked along the path between the buildings toward the warehouse. "You must be wary of Paul. Never let him near my factory. Once he's healed, kick him out." "Why?" Joka hurried after him, asking in confusion. As Charles walked, he answered, "Did you notice his injury?" "Yes." Joka walked beside Charles. "He's injured his hand, missing 2 fingers, but that doesn't affect his work." "You won't let that." "His right index and middle fingers," Charles emphasized. "Do you think it's such a coincidence? One finger is used to pull the trigger, and the other is hidden under the rifle, yet these 2 fingers were severed, rendering him unable to fight." Joka was stunned. "You mean, losing a few fingers is better than losing your life, father?" Charles said. "Paul is one of them. He lacks the courage to face the enemy, and he's good at disguising himself to make others think he's a good person. He intentionally approached you to leave a good impression." Joka was stunned. He hadn't considered these things at all. Charles's reminder, combined with recalling Paul's previous actions, seemed to confirm Charles's assessment. But, how did Charles figure that out? Joka wondered. Just then, a faint sound came from the warehouse next door storing scrap parts. Joka gestured to Charles, quietly ran over, and then forcefully pushed open the warehouse door. The people inside seemed startled, stopping what they were doing and looking over. They relaxed when they saw that it was only Joka and a child. There were 2 young men and a bald middle-aged man. The bald man held a hammer, nodded at the 2 men, and asked, "Are you here to steal something?" Joka understood. They were thieves stealing parts, these despicable thieves. He was about to step forward and chase them away when Charles stopped him. "Yes." Charles stepped forward with interest. "We wanted to see what valuables we had." "What are you doing?" The bald man glanced at Charles and replied coldly, "There's nothing valuable here except a pile of scrap metal. This place is full of discarded parts." As he spoke, he focused his attention on the object in his hand, carefully tapping it with his eyes, and tightened the screws when he felt it was ready. "But you guys, Uncle Guillaume is different," a young man answered for him. "He can turn trash into treasure. He can fix discarded parts and make them better than the originals, like this shock absorber." Another young man stared impatiently at Charles. "Go find what you need, don't bother us." Charles didn't move. He sized up the group and guessed their identities. This bald man named Guillaume was probably a worker at the motorcycle factory. His skills were so good that he could handcraft parts, or rather, he could piece together scrap parts into good ones. The 2 young men were probably motorcycle buyers or motorcycle enthusiasts. They wanted what Uncle Guillaume had. Charles was a little puzzled. "Uncle Guillaume, with such skills, why don't you work in a factory?" If the boss saw his skills, they would definitely give Guillaume a big job, Charles thought. Guillaume snorted, installing springs on the shock absorbers as he answered, "Give those capitalists ideas for modifications or improvements? They'll say that won't work, it's a stupid method, then turn around and apply for industrial property rights. And I'll get nothing." Guillaume turned to Charles. "If it were you, would you still do such a foolish thing?" Charles said. "Oh." Understanding dawned on him. The greed and short-sightedness of capitalists made Guillaume, despite having the technology and ideas, unwilling to share them, because they would be plagiarized immediately. Charles asked, "If there were a capitalist who could give you all the support you need, I mean, All your inventions would belong to you. Guillaume laughed heartily. Such a capitalist could only be the young Master Charles they're talking about. I heard he bought this factory. I might give it a try. Charles shrugged and said, You don't need to try, Mr. Guillaume. I intend to hire you to manage the motorcycle factory, and I will respect and protect all your industrial property rights. Guillaume stared at Charles in surprise, and it took him a long time to react. You are, young Master Charles. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 35 Sidecar. Whoosh, Guillaume opened the warehouse door and switched on the lights. Although the sun was high in the sky, the warehouse wasn't well lit. Without the lights, only hazy shadows could be seen. Under the light, rows of brand new motorcycles were neatly arranged in the warehouse, like troops awaiting inspection. To be honest, Master Charles, Guillaume hesitated, perhaps you shouldn't have bought the motorcycle factory. Its sales were already poor, and after the war started, they became even worse. Part of the reason the workers left was because of this. If the motorcycles didn't sell, they wouldn't get their wages, and they didn't want to waste their time here. Dejoko wholeheartedly agreed. He always believed that buying the motorcycle factory wasn't a wise choice, even though it was only at 35% of the original price. That didn't mean it would be profitable. How much inventory do we have in total? Charles asked. More than 1,500, Guillaume replied. The exact number needs to be checked in the documents. How many can you produce per month? Charles asked again. Guillaume and Dejoko stared at Charles as if they'd seen a ghost. The unsold inventory was still piling up. Shouldn't they be trying to sell it? And Charles was actually concerned about production volume. We can produce about 300 a month, Guillaume said, but I think, can we expand production? Charles asked again. For example, 3 shifts, hiring 3 groups of workers to produce at different times. Dejoko couldn't help but interject. Charles, shouldn't we consider the sales issue? Guillaume agreed. Mr. Dejoko is right, young Master Charles, you should listen to your father. After all, he was still just a child. He treated business like a game, Guillaume thought. Charles neither confirmed nor denied it. He walked up to the motorcycles, looked them over, casually grabbed one and twisted it, then turned back to ask, Are all these motorcycles usable? Guillaume, of course, Guillaume replied. They're ready to use as soon as you put on gasoline. They perform well. They're British Victory brands. Note, Victory motorcycles, also known as triumphant motorcycles, were characterized by their reliable performance and ease of maintenance, and were hailed by the army as trustworthy victories during World War I. Good. Charles stepped aside slightly, pointing to the support frame under the motorcycles, saying, We can extend a pillar from here and add a wheel to the side, giving it a more stable 3-wheeled structure. Adding a pillar at this position on the side wheel can provide a mount for the machine gunner, and we can also add some armor to the front. Is that feasible? Guillaume's eyes widened instantly. 2 wheels to 3? This seemed like it could carry more cargo and more people. A brilliant idea. Why hadn't anyone thought of it? After a long pause, Guillaume swallowed hard and nodded hastily. Why yes, young Master Charles, of course. It's not difficult. In fact, it's quite simple. I can probably modify it in just a few hours. Charles hummed in agreement. Then let's get started. Dejoko understood what Charles was planning, especially since Charles had mentioned machine guns earlier. Your idea is to convert them for military use. Of course, father, Charles replied. Nothing is more profitable than military production right now. Whatever the army needs, they'll buy in bulk, regardless of cost. Guillaume, who was pushing his motorcycle out, stopped and turned back, his voice excited. That's right, young Master Charles. If it's useful on the battlefield, we'll receive countless orders in a short time, and these motorcycles will sell out quickly, and it won't even be enough. Guillaume suddenly understood why Charles had suggested a 3-shift system to expand production. If that were the case, producing over 300 motorcycles a month was indeed too few. Ideally, they should produce 3,000 a month. We might be rich, Guillaume exclaimed, pushing the motorcycle along as fast as he could, eager to realize Charles's idea and see if the result would be useful. Dejoko and Charles followed Guillaume, wanting to observe the modification process and also to learn about his craftsmanship. Sidecar designs had actually existed by this time. 6 years earlier, during a Canadian exercise, A sergeant had innovatively added a sidecar to a motorcycle and equipped it with a machine gun. However, the sidecar was extremely bumpy, and the machine gun was completely inaccurate while moving. Officers commented, "It's more likely to kill its own people than the enemy." Therefore, no one paid attention to this design. It only made a few symbolic appearances in exercises before disappearing from sight, and no one bothered to patent it. This is why Guillaume and Djoko were unaware of it until now. Not only them, but only a handful of people worldwide knew or remembered this design. "So," Djoko asked, "this is yet another tank?" "No, it's different from a tank," Charles replied. "Tanks are for stopping bullets. This thing is speed, father. On the battlefield, sometimes speed means victory." Djoko struggled to understand this. A businessman by trade, he knew nothing about military matters. However, he believed Charles was right. After all, Charles had already led the French army to victory in 2 crucial battles. "Do you know what the neighbors are saying about you?" Djoko suddenly laughed. "What? They say you're even better than General Gallieni. They think you should be a general commanding the French army." Charles was terrified by this. He had no desire to serve in the army. They even made a comparison. Djoko, oblivious to Charles's expression, spoke with his face still beaming with pride. They said that Gallieni led the 6th Army in an attack against the Germans but lost. And you, with only a few hundred men, defeated the Germans twice. And the same group of Germans at that. What does that say? Charles lowered his voice to remind him, "Father, this might get me a conscription order." Djoko was startled. The smile vanished instantly, replaced by fear. "You're right, Charles, they can't say that. This is utter nonsense. We've never done anything like that. We just invent things, that's all." Charles was silent for a moment. He realized that this wasn't something he could simply ignore or try to bury his head in the sand with another explanation. The people would still spread the word, and the military and government would still hear about it. After a moment's thought, he said thoughtfully, "No, father. I did do those things. Not only did I do those things, I also trained the troops, drove the deserters back, and stopped the army from collapsing. They only returned to the battlefield because they heard about tanks." Djoko was completely bewildered. What was Charles thinking? After a pause, he suddenly understood. If denial was useless, then embellish it to make it sound more like a rumor, turning it into a completely illogical folk tale. Chapter 36 Wages and Dignity. Over an hour later, the prototype of a sidecar motorcycle was laid out before the 3 men. Although more than an hour of continuous work had left Guillaume slightly tired, he was still radiant, his eyes shining. He paced around the motorcycle, stopping now and then to examine and touch it, as if admiring a fine work of art. "I think this idea is feasible, young Master Charles," Guillaume said excitedly. "It could play a significant role in the military. They would be willing to buy it." "How can you be so sure?" Djoko asked. "I was a soldier, Mr. Djoko." Guillaume, who was bending over to examine the welded joints of the chassis, straightened up, lifted his war clothes, and revealed a prominent scar on his lower right abdomen to the 2 men. This was left by a German bayonet. "I fought in the Franco-German War. I know what war requires." As he said this, a flash of anger crossed Guillaume's eyes. The soldiers who fought in the Franco-German War were also heroes. They fought just as bravely and desperately against the enemy on the battlefield. However, simply because the war was lost, leaving France with shame, everyone placed the blame and anger on them, making them sinners. This isn't fair, Charles understood. "You can put down your burden now, Uncle Guillaume. We won't lose this battle. They will redefine the war you fought, and you too." Guillaume looked at Charles sharply, as if pricked by a needle, and asked doubtfully, Will they? Will they? They might not, but we will." Charles's words were somewhat incomprehensible, and Guillaume didn't understand. Charles explained in a slightly immature voice, "If we lose the war, the capitalists will intentionally direct their anger towards you to divert the public's attention. But if we win, they won't be stingy with their praise, while taking all the credit for themselves, so the people won't care how much money they've plundered." Guillaume was utterly shocked, especially by the first part. The capitalists will intentionally direct their anger towards you. Guillaume had never considered this possibility. He had always thought it was just a misunderstanding the people had about veterans. Reminded by Charles, Guillaume recalled the events of that time. Indeed, newspapers large and small were criticizing the army's corruption and incompetence, but never mentioned that this corruption and incompetence were caused by the capitalists. "Damn capitalists," Guillaume spat out through gritted teeth. He gritted his teeth in hatred, recalling the decades of humiliation, insults, and accusations he had suffered. A wave of sorrow washed over him, making him afraid to even leave the factory and interact with others. In my opinion, Charles continued, you are certainly heroes. You have given everything for France. You deserve respect, it's just that some people don't understand. If we win this war, and you have played a vital role in it, their attitude towards you will change. Guillaume nodded heavily. That's right. If France could wash away its previous shame, the army would once again be accepted by the people, and the soldiers would once again gain their approval. Those who had fought for France and were now contributing would be no exception. Therefore, Guillaume looked up at Charles. We must strive to help France win. That's exactly right, Charles agreed. Dejauka, silently observing all this, secretly praised Charles. Charles knew how to give respect and recognition to others and bring them to the same side. When survival was paramount, some people preferred these things to higher wages, because dignity couldn't be bought with money, and this would make the motorcycle factory's production more stable and reliable. Charles nodded towards the sidecar and asked, don't you want to try it, Uncle Guillaume? Me? Guillaume hesitated. Shouldn't the inventor be the first to test-ride it? Guillaume hadn't expected Charles to give him this honor. I can't ride, Charles explained with a smile. Guillaume's eyes were filled with gratitude. He mounted the sidecar and pressed the starter, and after 2 clicks, it started. The sidecar slowly drove into the test track. At first, it wasn't fast. Guillaume carefully drove it around a few corners, gradually accelerating, and soon it was speeding along, accompanied by Guillaume's cheers. Young Master Charles, Guillaume shouted, you really should try it. It's much more stable than a motorcycle. This wasn't entirely true. A sidecar motorcycle was actually more difficult to handle than a 2-wheeled motorcycle. Guillaume said this because he had made it himself. What's it called? Dejauka asked. A sidecar motorcycle, Charles replied. A very fitting name, Dejauka said. Sidecar refers to the side of the motorcycle, and it has 3 wheels, hence the name. Dejauka looked at the sidecar motorcycle kicking up dust and asked with some concern, I have a problem, Charles. Aren't you worried that it might have the same problems as a tank? Dejauka was referring to the possibility of French capitalists copying and suppressing industrial property rights. No, at least for now, there's no need to worry, Charles replied. Why? Dejauka looked at Charles with a puzzled expression. What was the difference between a sidecar motorcycle and a tank in terms of industrial property rights? Currently, France only has this one motorcycle factory, father, Charles replied. France originally had 3 motorcycle factories, Harley-Davidson, licensed from the United States, Douglas, licensed from Britain, and Victory, licensed from the United Kingdom. The first 2 companies fell to the Germans during their offensive. Most of France's industrial areas are located in the north, where abundant mineral resources are suitable for industrial production. Charles acquired the only remaining Victory motorcycle factory. Dejauka raised an eyebrow. You mean, if they want to imitate or bypass our industrial property rights, they first need a motorcycle factory? Yes, Charles nodded. They need to establish a production line, skilled workers, and most importantly, their motorcycles must be as excellent as Victory. Victory had withstood the test of the battlefield, something only Charles knew. The most suitable equipment for the battlefield doesn't necessarily have to be advanced, but it must be reliable and easy to maintain. This is the battlefield. If it breaks down and is left stranded, it's difficult to repair, potentially costing soldiers or communications personnel their lives. Victory possessed these advantages, which capitalists couldn't replicate unless they directly copied Victory, which would face lawsuits from British companies. In short, Charles's innovation this time was to bind British companies together, forming a chain of interests that would deter French capitalists from making any rash moves. Dejauka exclaimed. So shrewd. Charles, you didn't think of all this beforehand, did you? A rare maturity appeared on Charles's youthful face. I had no choice, father, otherwise we'd go bankrupt. Dejauka felt a pang of shame. For the first time, he hated his own incompetence. Otherwise, Charles wouldn't have needed to worry so much. This has nothing to do with you, father. Charles seemed to see through Dejauka's thoughts. He explained, I chose to stand against those capitalists. Otherwise, we could have made more money than we could ever spend in a lifetime just by selling our industrial assets to them. Dejauka nodded. Charles was telling the truth. Soon, Dejauka's worry returned. This meant Charles wanted more than just money. He wanted power? To break their monopoly? Joka looked at Charles, shock and worry flashing in his eyes. This was the capitalists' core interest. They would stop at nothing to deal with Charles. Chapter 37 nearly triggered a mutiny. Major Brownie had been feeling rather frustrated these past few days. He and his 3rd Battalion had been stuck on the north bank of the Marne since the defeat of the Germans, unable to move. Of their 12 tanks, 5 had been destroyed in the fighting, mostly by friendly fire, but that didn't matter. What mattered was their victory. Of the remaining 7 tanks, 6 were malfunctioning, and only 1 was operational, but it was uncertain how long it would remain functional. When Major General Gator led his troops in pursuit of the Germans, he tossed Major Brownie an order: repair them, then catch up at top speed. Major Brownie couldn't help but curse inwardly. That idiot. We're soldiers, not engineers. You expect us to repair them? Besides, these things only have a top speed of 15 kilometers per hour. At top speed, they might break down every half hour. Normally, they can only travel at around 8 kilometers per hour, and they need maintenance every hour. Keep in mind that an average person walks at 3 to 6 kilometers per hour. You expect us to keep up with these things? Major Brownie could only reply yes, sir, and then try his best to complete the order. The reality was worse than Major Brownie had imagined. He went to the tractor factory several times hoping someone could help with repairs, but the responses were always the same. Major, I think you should wait for new tanks. We are producing them at full capacity. Those tanks are probably unusable. They're riddled with bullet holes, and the engines have been damaged or burned out. Repairing them might be more difficult than building a new one. Major Brownie admitted they had a point, but when would new tanks arrive? The reply was, we are waiting for government funding. Once the funds arrive, we will start production immediately. Major Brownie immediately realized he was in for a long wait. Government funding had a complicated procedure, and even in wartime, it was impossible to get tanks immediately. Sure enough, after 3 days, there was still no progress. Meanwhile, Major General Guard kept sending his communications officer back to urge them on. Where are our tanks? Aren't they repaired yet? They're just tractors. Where are you? Bring your tanks and follow. God, we've already lost thousands of men, even though the tanks could easily break through the lines. These weren't exaggerations. The German army was highly skilled. Even though they had lost the war, they quickly reorganized and fought their way back, retreating in several well-paced, coordinated groups. The pursuing French troops, on the other hand, were like children chasing kites, frantically pursuing the enemy only to fall into German traps time and again, suffering heavy casualties. But what could Major Brownie do? He couldn't possibly assemble a bunch of tanks and carry them to the front lines, could he? If Matthew were here, someone said. That guy not only drives tanks, he's a tank mechanic. I wonder how Matthew is. He had his right leg amputated. I saw him yesterday. He's being taken good care of and recovering well, Eve replied. Matthew was his comrade in arms from the same tank crew, and Eve had taken the time to visit the field hospital. That's quite a surprise. Major Brownie was rather surprised by Eve's words. As far as I know, field hospitals aren't places that take good care of people. As a French officer, Major Brownie certainly knew what field hospitals were like. Few people carried into those places came out alive, even those with minor injuries. Our field hospital is different, Major, Eve, leaning against a rock to rest while holding his machine gun, said lazily. Our field hospital has Master Charles. What do you mean? Major Brownie looked at Eve with a puzzled expression, and the others also cast puzzled glances at Eve. Haven't you heard? Eve, who had been half closing his eyes, opened them and looked at the people around him with surprise. Young Master Charles used his own money to replenish supplies and manpower for the field hospital, which undoubtedly makes our 5th field hospital the best equipped and has the highest survival rate. This news has spread throughout the entire army. I thought you knew. Major Brownie and the soldiers were all stunned. After a while, some nodded slightly with emotion, while others made the sign of the cross on their chests. A noble man, he is a true hero, may God bless him. If all the capitalists in France were like him, this country would be saved. Hearing this makes me feel much more at ease. At least I know that if I am wounded, I will receive good care instead of being left to die. For a soldier, the most tragic thing is not dying at the hands of the enemy on the battlefield, but being abandoned by his own people in a field hospital, and then watching his life slowly disappear in despair, helpless. Major Brownie grumbled sullenly. If he cares so much, He should have given us tanks as soon as possible. That would reduce casualties, Major." Yves's voice was filled with anger. "Didn't you hear that Francis stripped Charles of his management of the tractor factory?" "What?" Major Brownie jumped to his feet in shock. "They didn't tell me that." "Of course they wouldn't," Yves explained. "They discovered that converting tractors into tanks could make money, and of course they didn't want to give up this opportunity." Charles was sidelined. "I heard they shoved a useless motorcycle factory into his hands in exchange," which was certainly not Charles's choice. The soldiers instantly became indignant. "These capitalists are a disgrace to France. They're money-grubbing beasts, and we're fighting for these beasts, risking our lives for them. How could they treat Charles like this?" Several men even got up to leave, carrying their rifles. Brownie quickly stopped them. "Where are you going?" "We're going to kill those guys and help Master Charles get the tractor factory back. It all belongs to Master Charles." The soldiers responded enthusiastically. "Me too, count me in." "No, no. Listen to me." Major Brownie tried to calm the soldiers down. "We don't know anything. Let me go talk to Charles first. Maybe things aren't like that." The soldiers thought this made sense and said one after another, "Yes, Major. Please give our regards to Master Charles. If anyone bullies him, let him tell us, and we won't let those guys get away with it." "That's right, we're not to be trifled with." Major Brownie was secretly alarmed. God, that guy Charles, just a few rumors about him almost sparked a mutiny. Chapter 38 Marketing Strategies. At noon, music filled the town's church, and the bells rang 12 times. Major Brownie, who had just arrived in town, ordered a sandwich on the street and hurriedly stuffed it into his stomach on his way to the motorcycle factory. Then, wiping the grease from his mouth in front of the factory gate, he explained his purpose to the security guard. Charles was somewhat surprised to see Major Brownie. "Major, I thought you had already gone to chase the Germans." "No, Master Charles." Major Brownie's face was full of helplessness. "We're waiting for the tanks." He then briefly explained what had happened, and asked Charles worriedly, "Were you treated unfairly? Those bastards actually kicked the inventor out of the tractor factory?" No, Charles replied. "There was indeed some unfairness, but it was more of a business deal. This is what happened." Joka answered for him. "We were forced to sell the industrial rights to the tanks." Charles looked at Joka in surprise. Although there was an element of forced in selling the tank rights, it couldn't be entirely described as forced. Djokovic gave Charles a wink, indicating that he should say it that way, otherwise it would frustrate his supporters. Major Brownie had no doubts. He could even guess what was going on. Anyone who had served in the military knew about the conflict between the Saint Etienne machine gun and the Hotchkiss machine gun. Major Brownie's eyes were filled with anger. "I knew it. Those guys only think about making money and don't care about the country's fate, let alone the lives of the soldiers." Major Brownie hesitated for a moment, then leaned closer and whispered in a voice only the two of them could hear, "Do you need our help?" Like a robbery. This was certainly not a mutiny. It was just a few soldiers looking to make a fortune storming into a capitalist's house, looting them, accidentally injuring a few people, and then making their escape. At this time, who would care about such a thing? "No, Major," Charles refused without hesitation. "We've found a new way out." "A new way out? Tell me about the situation," Charles countered. "Do you really need tanks? I mean, if we gave you tanks now, would you be able to use them?" Major Brownie considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Probably not. They're too slow. They'll never catch up with the Germans' retreat." "That's exactly what I was saying," Charles replied. "Tanks are good for assaults, but not for chasing the enemy." Charles stepped aside, displaying the sidecar motorcycle to Major Brownie. "I think you need this more." Major Brownie stared in surprise at the three-wheeled monster before him, examining it for a moment before recognizing it. "This is a motorcycle? You added a wheel to a motorcycle, not just a wheel, Major," Charles explained. "See that support pillar next to the side wheel?" Major Brownie's eyes lit up when he found the pillar. "Is that for mounting our machine guns?" "Of course," Charles replied. "But we can't provide you with machine guns." No, that's not important," Major Brownie replied excitedly, eyeing the sidecar motorcycle. "We just won a battle. We have machine guns, lots of them." It was a Maxim machine gun captured from the Germans, far superior to the French Saint Etienne and Hotchkiss machine guns. The French soldiers weren't familiar with this type of machine gun, and considering the issue of ammunition replenishment, German bullets were different from French bullets, and the most likely outcome of using Maxim machine guns interchangeably in the army would be running out of ammunition and unable to replenish them. Therefore, most of them, including the ammunition, were left behind as spoils of war. Perfect, Charles said. If it's a Maxim, we can add an ammunition rack in the rear, so we can carry even more ammunition. Major Brownie nodded excitedly. A vehicle-mounted heavy machine gun, capable of carrying a lot of ammunition, he could almost see himself driving forward, firing at the enemy. After admiring it for a while, Major Brownie asked, "How many of these do you have?" "One," Charles replied. "Only one right now." The previously energetic Major Brownie instantly wilted like a cabbage. "Master Charles, we need at least 50. Charles turned to Guillaume, who understood. After a moment's thought, Guillaume answered for him, "I'll find a group of workers to modify the existing motorcycles. We can produce 100 in a day. After all, it's just adding a few supports and a wheel." "Fantastic." Major Brownie perked up again. 100. "That's enough to equip my entire battalion." Major Brownie's 3rd battalion had only a little over 200 men left. Assuming 3 men per sidecar, 100 sidecars could carry 300 men, freeing up capacity for ammunition and supplies. "What should we do?" Major Brownie asked. "Bring your men here, they need to learn to drive," Charles replied. "Yes, Master Charles," Major Brownie replied. "I'll bring them over right away," but he stopped after taking a few steps, a hint of embarrassment on his face. "But Master Charles, we don't have the money to pay for this." "Don't worry, Major," Charles replied generously. "All of this is free. You and your men risked your lives to protect France. Of course I can't ask you to pay." Major Brownie opened his mouth as if to say something, but ultimately kept quiet, simply giving Master Charles a proper salute before turning and leaving. After Major Brownie left, Djoka complained, "Charles, we don't have much money left in our account." "If this continues..." "I know, Father," Charles interrupted Djoka. "But every penny we spend can save many lives, so it's worth it." Djoka nodded silently. Uncle Guillaume, moved to tears by these words, rushed forward to stand before Charles. "Don't worry, young Master Charles," he said, "we have others, they'll help you accomplish this. This isn't just your responsibility." With that, Uncle Guillaume hopped on his old motorcycle and rode away. He was going to call back his former co-workers to the factory. He was looking for capable people. Watching Uncle Guillaume's departing figure, Daleka murmured, "We lied to him." "Wasn't that a bit much?" Charles replied, "As long as our purpose is right, there's nothing wrong with it." "Right, Father," Daleka nodded silently. This was a marketing strategy Charles and Daleka had agreed upon. By sending a batch of sidecar motorcycles to the military, they would make the army aware of the importance of motorcycles, thus quickly opening up sales channels and even increasing their price. At the same time, this would also improve Charles's reputation among the military and civilians. Chapter 39 Ammunition Universality Issues. Not long after, Uncle Guillaume returned with a group of workers. These were workers Uncle Guillaume knew well. They possessed exceptional skills, completely different from those who rose to middle and high positions through sycophancy or nepotism. Furthermore, these men were quite loyal. Uncle Guillaume led them to Charles and said, "Young Master Charles, after hearing about your work, they all offered to modify these motorcycles for us free of charge." The workers chimed in, "Helping the army is helping ourselves, young Master Charles. We also want to do our part for France. Yes, many of us have children serving in the army. We support your actions. If you don't have enough funds, we can contribute some. Thank you everyone," Charles greeted the workers. "I appreciate your kindness, but I need workers who will work for me long term, so of course you need wages, otherwise, you won't be able to support your families." Charles wouldn't be greedy for such a small amount of money, he'd rather be generous and earn more goodwill. Sure enough, the workers silently nodded in acceptance upon hearing about their families. They weren't wealthy enough to work for free. "Don't worry," Charles reassured them, "if you work diligently and manage the motorcycle factory well, I can earn money. That way, I can pay your wages while continuing to help those in need. What do you think?" "Of course, young Master Charles, that's our goal, we'd love to do that." Charles would train these people to become the backbone of the motorcycle factory. In their future work and lives, they would pass on Charles's story and spirit to every worker, layer by layer. Then, all the workers would know that their hard work wasn't exploitation, but rather indirectly helping those in need. This might seem unimportant, after all, workers are paid for their labor. However, the workers' enthusiasm varied drastically. At least, the more than 500 strikes that occurred annually in France during this period wouldn't happen in Charles's factory, and management talent and skilled workers were difficult to poach with high salaries, because they wanted more than just wages. Without hesitation, the workers began modifying the sidecar. Soon, someone noticed the prototype's flaws. "Hey, Guillaume. Isn't just one steel pipe too fragile? It'll break easily while driving. We should add more pipes." "That's right, and this machine gun mount, we need to support a Maxim machine gun. I suggest changing it to a tripod, it'll be much more stable. Also, shouldn't we equip it with shock absorbers? Otherwise, even a small bump can shake the gunner's backside in two." The workers laughed heartily, and Guillaume responded to each point, making improvements to the sidecar on the blueprints. The result of their brainstorming was quite astonishing. In less than an hour, the sidecar had been upgraded several times, essentially resembling a modern sidecar. "Uncle Guillaume," Charles called out to Guillaume, who was about to test drive the new vehicle. "There are few things to keep in mind when driving. Start or accelerate as smoothly as possible, otherwise you'll be pulled to the right. The same applies when braking and decelerating, as the front of the vehicle will be pulled to the left when braking suddenly." Guillaume looked at Charles in surprise. "Young Master Charles, how did you know that? I thought it was a problem with the prototype." Guillaume had noticed these things while driving before, but he didn't know why and didn't dare to say anything. Now, reminded by Charles, he realized that this might be a common feature of all sidecar motorcycles. "No, Uncle Guillaume," Charles explained, "it's because the power and braking of a sidecar motorcycle are not centered, it's asymmetrical. The sidecar always moves in the opposite direction to the motorcycle due to inertia, and the heavier the sidecar, the more obvious this effect is." Knowing this is crucial, Guillaume nodded, seemingly understanding. He didn't know what inertia was, but since young Master Charles could accurately point out this problem without even test driving it, it couldn't be wrong. Those who have received an education are truly different, Guillaume thought to himself. Just then, Major Brownie arrived with his men. More than 200 soldiers marched into the factory in neat formation, spontaneously saluting and greeting Charles. In the soldiers' eyes, Charles was their comrade in arms, for he had fought alongside them in previous battles. Charles was their savior, for the tanks he invented had saved them, more than once. They even considered Charles the hope of France, because only a capitalist like Charles would so selflessly help the army and the country. Major Brownie loudly ordered the troops to disperse. He walked up to Charles, saluted, and turned to wave for the carriages to follow. "I'm worried you'll need to test our machine guns. So I'm sending a batch now, and more will follow." "You've thought of me first, Major," Charles said. "However, I think you'd better bring a batch of German rifles as well." "Rifles? German ones?" Major Brownie looked at Charles, puzzled. "Why, have you considered this?" Charles explained. "You're using German Maxim machine guns, but French Lebel rifles. What will happen on the battlefield?" Major Brownie nodded slightly with a no. The two types of ammunition were different. When the fighting became extremely intense, soldiers might grab a handful of bullets from their ammunition boxes and rush into battle, only to find out upon reaching the enemy that they had Maxim machine gun bullets. Or conversely, a few Lebel rifle bullets might be mixed into the Maxim machine gun's ammunition belt. Either way, it could cause deadly chaos. Major Brownie looked at Charles, his eyes filled with trust. Although he still had questions, he habitually assumed Charles was always right. "So, if we're going to use the Maxim machine gun, we should be equipped with and familiar with German rifles." "Of course," Charles nodded. "But what about supplies?" Major Brownie asked again. "What if we run out of ammunition, and our comrades in logistics units only bring us French 8mm bullets?" "Major," Charles interrupted Major Brownie, "if you're operating this sidecar motorcycle, you'll be surrounded by Germans. That means you're more likely to get German 7.92mm bullets than 8mm bullets." "What?" Major Brownie looked at Charles in horror. Did this mean we were going to operate deep into enemy territory? "But we only have a little over 200 men. We should discuss tactics." Charles seemed to see through Major Brownie's thoughts. He calmly asked, "Do you have a map, Major?" "Yes, of course." Major Brownie hurriedly pulled a military map from his pocket and spread it out in front of Charles, his eyes filled with fear. "This kid. Does he think we're Superman?" Charles, of course, didn't think Major Brownie was Superman. He simply wanted to teach Brownie how to conduct mobile warfare. Driving a sidecar carrying a Maxim machine gun, if they didn't use mobile warfare but instead fought a positional battle step by step, it was tantamount to suicide. Charles didn't want to see that result, because it meant not a single sidecar could be sold. Chapter 40. They're doomed. At dawn, the sun had just risen from the thin mist. Major General Gator, having just woken from his nap, hadn't even had time to wash up. He sat in his tent, staring at the map, his brow furrowed, occasionally letting out a sigh. Suddenly, a burst of intense gunfire erupted from ahead. Startled, Major General Gator jerked his head up, then turned his gaze to the outside of the tent. Soon, a communications soldier rushed in, reporting, "General, the reconnaissance unit has been ambushed by the enemy, over 70 casualties." The staff officer followed the communications soldier into the tent, his expression suggesting he had expected this outcome. "Order the troops to launch an attack," Major General Gator commanded without hesitation. "Annihilate them at all costs." "Yes, sir," the communications soldier replied, then went to relay the order. Major General Gator sighed helplessly. Although the Fifth Army had won a battle and was pursuing the enemy, they felt like they were being led by the nose. Every hill, every mound, even a small patch of forest they passed could be a German ambush point. The Germans were very flexible in their tactics, sometimes deploying small, sometimes large forces in ambush. When the French sent small units to engage, they would launch a full-scale attack and annihilate them. When the French organized a large force to encircle them, they found the enemy already deserted, leaving behind notes in broken French as a greeting. This forced the Fifth Army to advance only 8 kilometers a day, with hundreds or even thousands of casualties per kilometer. Major General Gator gritted his teeth in frustration. "Tanks, we need tanks. If the tanks were in front, this wouldn't be the situation. Haven't they arrived yet?" "What's going on with Brownie, General?" the staff officer whispered. "The old tanks can't be repaired, and the new tanks haven't been delivered to Major Brownie." So, this was the first time Major General Gator had felt such hatred for capitalists. When Charles invented the tank, he produced 12 in just half a day. It was essentially just a few steel plates welded onto a tractor. But now, the capitalists are playing the hunger marketing trick again. They deliberately delay to create the illusion of a severe tank shortage in the army, making the soldiers eagerly await and even demand them, forcing the military to raise prices to buy them. Major General Gator may not care about the number of casualties, but if this continues, his Fifth Army will be wiped out, and he, the army commander, will be left with no troops. More importantly, Major General Gator senses that the Germans seem unwilling to accept defeat, and they may be gathering troops during the retreat to launch a counterattack. Major General Gator is unsure whether he can withstand the German counterattack without tanks. Just as Major General Gator is facing a dilemma, cheers come from outside the tent, along with a faint roar of engines. "What's going on?" Major General Gator asks. "Have reinforcements arrived?" The sound of the engines is not as muffled as that of the tanks, so Major General Gator assumes it is a truck carrying reinforcements. Just as the staff officer was about to step out of the tent to check the situation, a communications soldier rushed in excitedly to report, "General, it's Major Brownie. He's here with the 3rd Infantry Battalion." "Major Brownie?" Major General Guard's eyes lit up. "So, their tanks are repaired?" "No, General," the communications soldier replied. "They're riding up, probably motorcycles, three-wheeled motorcycles, driven by curiosity." Major General Guard and his staff officer bent down and crawled out of the tent, grabbing the binoculars around their necks and looking towards the road half a kilometer away. Sure enough, they saw a line of motorcycles speeding along the road. They were indeed three-wheeled motorcycles, each equipped with a Maxim machine gun. This made Major General Guard's eyes light up. Was this a new type of tank? Had that young man, Charles, invented it again? Then Major General Guard realized something was wrong. The motorcycles showed no sign of stopping. "Where are they going?" Major General Guard exclaimed. The staff officer glanced at the direction the motorcycles were heading and said, "General, their target is the mountain road." No, make them stop," Major General Guard roared. "They should stay and fight with us, not run into the mountains. These are shameful deserters." The staff officer immediately ordered the communications soldier, "Make them stop?" "Yes, sir," the communications soldier replied, skillfully pulling a warhorse and leaping onto it, urging it to chase after the motorcycles. However, when the staff officer saw the horse trailing far behind, leaving only exhaust fumes and dust. He knew the order couldn't reach Major Brownie. This was intentional on Major Brownie's part. He didn't want Guards Communications soldier to catch up and give them orders. This was also Charles's intention. A very important point is that you must detach yourself from unit command. Charles squatted on the ground, staring thoughtfully at the map. Why? Major Brownie's fear deepened. What could a force of 200 men accomplish detached from the main force? Without support, they wouldn't even be enough to fill the enemy's teeth. Your commander doesn't know how to use sidecar motorcycles in combat, Charles explained. They'll treat them like tanks, using them to block bullets. That would be the end for you. Major Brownie was somewhat embarrassed. He had originally thought the same thing, to use the sidecar motorcycles to fire Maxim guns at the enemy positions. So, Major Brownie hesitated. We can't fight like that, right? Major Brownie didn't care about losing face. If he didn't find out now, it wouldn't just be losing face on the battlefield, it would be losing his life. Besides, Charles wasn't a loser, he was a genius. Of course not, Charles replied. The front armor of the motorcycle is only 5 millimeters thick. Enemy rifles can easily penetrate it from 200 meters away. The sides and rear are completely exposed to fire without any cover. Charles then added, we can't install thicker armor, otherwise it will affect driving. This puzzled Major Brownie. If a sidecar can't stop bullets and can't attack the enemy, what's the point? Speed, Major, Charles emphasized. Its advantage is speed. Speed. Major Brownie was bewildered. Could speed be an advantage on the battlefield? Wouldn't it just lead to a faster death? Charles pointed to the map and analyzed. The reason the Germans were able to fight and retreat was because they left a force in the rear to cover us. Their covering force was prepared for battle. They dug trenches or hid in advantageous terrain, setting up their guns and waiting for us to walk right into their line of fire. Of course we can't just walk into their line of fire, Major Brownie objected, but we can only catch up with them from behind. Charles didn't speak, but turned and stared coldly at Major Brownie with a questioning gaze. Major Brownie suddenly understood. Infantry could indeed only chase the enemy from behind, but motorcycles had a speed advantage of several times, even dozens of times. Major Brownie hesitated before saying, you mean we can bypass the German covering forces and attack their main force? Yes, Charles said, their main force is completely unprepared. They think that with the covering forces behind them, no enemy will come up. So, they'll march with rifles slung over their shoulders, artillery pulled by horses and not deployed, the whole column marching in a straight line along the road, or they'll huddle together to camp and rest on flat, open ground. If suddenly 100 Maxim machine guns appear on their flanks, Major Brownie excitedly interrupted, they're doomed. They might not even have the chance to fight back. Chapter 41 Maintain speed. It was just past noon. Warm sunlight streamed through the windows of the canvas tent. Cluck sat on his chaise longue, silently staring at the coffee in his hand. It clearly emitted an enticing aroma, but in Cluck's eyes, it resembled a cup of congealed, blackened blood, filled with death and pain. According to the statistics sent by various units, our army has suffered approximately 60,000 casualties, the staff officer reported, marking on the map as he held up the latest intelligence. The 2nd and 3rd Corps are on our left flank, the 4th Corps on our right flank, and the location of the 9th Corps is unknown. They should be scattered behind our lines and not yet organized. Cluck, who had been motionless like a statue, suddenly raised his head. His voice was not loud, but unusually cold. Remove Major General Demke, replace him with Major General Baldwin, and order him to organize the 9th Corps before nightfall tonight. Yes, sir, the staff officer responded and immediately had the communications officer relay Cluck's order. One of Cluck's strengths was his exceptional memory. He seemed to have the main commanders, their strengths, and personalities of every corps and even every division under the First Army etched into his mind, allowing him to deploy them effortlessly without consulting documents, and without ever making a mistake. After a moment of silence, Cluck asked again, where's the Second Army now? The staff officer glanced at the map and replied, 5 kilometers behind us. Considering our retreat, they have halted their advance. Cluck grunted and calmly said, tell them they can resume their advance first thing tomorrow morning. But General, the staff officer said anxiously, the chief of the General Staff's order is to continue the retreat. We face 2 enemy armies, and the British Expeditionary Force has rejoined the counter-offensive. Cluck didn't speak, but a cold glance at the staff officer silenced him. The staff officer simply replied softly, yes, sir, and relayed the order again. Kluck knew he still had a chance. Although the First Army had suffered over 60,000 casualties, it still possessed over 200,000 troops. Their strength remained. As for the two French army groups, they were only intimidating in number. French tactics were always so predictable that Kluck could guess their next move. The Germans only needed to take cover, inflict casualties and demoralize them, then launch a counter-offensive to defeat them and win. As for the chief of the general staff, he was merely intimidated by the enemy's strength. Once the First Army defeated the French again, he would change his mind. I will win, Kluck thought, even if the enemy had armored monsters, my artillery would blast them all to smithereens. Kluck rose and stood by the window, watching the soldiers resting in the open field. These were the three mixed infantry brigades directly under the army group, totaling over 20,000 men. They were the Reich's most loyal and elite troops, highly trained, and showed no sign of discouragement even in this adversity. Seeing their methodical approach, Kluck confidently declared, nothing can stop their march on Paris. Nothing, however, as if in response to Kluck's assessment, a sudden burst of gunfire erupted, throwing the orderly camp into chaos. Several soldiers, right before Kluck's eyes, were struck by bullets and fell to the ground screaming. What's happening? Kluck shouted. He recognized the sound as Maxim machine gun fire, while the enemy wasn't equipped with Maxims. Had friendly forces mistaken them for enemies and launched an attack? Just as Kluck was wondering, several bullets whizzed through his tent, and a three-wheeled motorcycle sped past him in astonishment, only a dozen meters away. Before Kluck could even see clearly, the battalion commander of the guards rushed in, tackling Kluck to the ground. The next second, machine gun bullets whizzed overhead with a rat-a-tat-tat sound. That one glance had confirmed that it was the enemy. The Germans didn't have these motorcycles, and the riders were even wearing the red trousers typical of French soldiers. So why had the enemy reached this place? Why hadn't the regiment providing cover from the rear sent any warning? Had they been wiped out before they could react? Impossible. Yet, the fact remained, the enemy was right in front of them, and had nearly riddled him, the army commander, with bullets. The force that stormed into the Kluck camp was Major Brownie's 3rd Infantry Battalion. They had set off from the motorcycle factory in their sidecars at daybreak, and while buying supplies in a small town, they had found two locals familiar with the area to guide them. They successfully shook off Major General Guard's main force and entered the mountain roads. The motorcycle convoy wound its way through the mountain trails, taking several hours to return to the main road. They hadn't gone far on the main road, and after rounding a hill, a vast open area and a massive military camp suddenly came into view. Caught off guard, the motorcycles slowed down one after another, and the soldiers stared blankly at the densely packed enemy before them. The Germans didn't react. They didn't believe the enemy could have gotten this far, naturally assuming the convoy was one of their own. God, there are at least 20,000 men, Machine Gunner Eve, sitting in the sidecar, reported to Major Brownie, who had just arrived. What should we do, Major? Major Brownie craned his neck to look over the motorcycles ahead at the open ground, gritting his teeth as he replied, what else can we do? We have no way out. Major Brownie turned to look at the sidecars that were following behind, waving his hand and ordering, enemy ahead, prepare for battle, enemy ahead, prepare for battle, ... The orders were relayed. The motorcyclists crouched low, burying their heads under their armor, while the machine gunners loaded their ammunition belts, pulled the bolts, and gripped the gun handles with both hands. Major Brownie was one of the machine gunners, operating a machine gun from his sidecar. Maintain speed, Major Brownie added, charge forward as fast as you can, don't look back. The soldiers responded sparsely. Yes, Major. One asked fearfully, Major, what if there are still enemies ahead if we charge forward? Major Brownie replied calmly, then kill them. Before the soldiers could ask any more questions, Major Brownie grabbed the machine gun in one hand and waved it forward with the other, shouting, charge, lads. Kill them all. The motorcycles roared off the road and sped into the open ground, cutting diagonally along the left flank of the German camp like a sharp knife. The Maxim machine gun in the right-hand sidecar opened fire as they approached the camp, a dense hail of bullets sweeping towards the German camp like a hurricane. Note: France switched to right-hand driving after Napoleon, unlike Britain, hence the French sidecar motorcycle had a right-hand sidecar. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 42. Do you want to do it again? Blood splattered, screams erupted. Bullets flew wildly over the German camp, whistling and leaving clear trails in the air like kite strings. But the trails didn't end beautifully. Instead, they revealed mangled flesh and glaring crimson. Caught completely off guard, the German troops were thrown into chaos by the hail of bullets. Many died before they even understood what was happening. Officers shouted desperately to regain control, but they didn't know what was going on either, only managing weak cries of, "Enemy situation. Prepare for battle." But where was the enemy? What preparations were they making? Where were they firing? Those standing, lying prone, and lying in pools of blood were all their own men. Occasionally, a dark shadow would flash by amidst the roar of engines, followed by the terrifying blast of machine gun fire, bullets mercilessly reaping lives like giant scythes. The soldiers were terrified, gripping their rifles but afraid to pull the trigger. Firing under these circumstances would only hit their own men. The cavalry horses, neatly tethered at the other end of the camp, sensed the danger and reared up, neighing loudly. Soon they broke free of their reins and galloped wildly, trampling countless soldiers in their path. A wagon loaded with ammunition was being pulled erratically by the frightened horses. The ropes binding the ammunition boxes snapped in the violent jolting, and shells rained down along the wagon. Finally, a volley of bullets struck the wagon. A deafening explosion followed, and the exploding ammunition instantly tore the wagon and horses to pieces. Flames and smoke rose into a small mushroom cloud in the camp, and nearby German soldiers were all thrown violently into the air before falling back to the ground in pieces. Major Brownie, who was firing, was shocked by the scene. He had never known the Germans were so easy to deal with. They seemed to simply point their guns at the enemy and pull the trigger. The speeding sidecars were unstable, bullets flew wildly up and down uncontrollably, swaying sideways upon impact due to vibration and inertia. There was absolutely no accuracy. However, they didn't need accuracy. The enemy was right in front of them, clustered together. Whether the bullets hit up, down, left, or right, they were all aimed at the enemy. Major Brownie, however, felt that most German soldiers weren't hit by bullets, but rather wounded in the chaos, indiscriminate firing injuring their own men, panicked running, trampling by horses, and secondary explosions of artillery shells. Finally, the motorcycle convoy broke through the German camp. Charles had instructed, "Don't linger, Major. You must fully utilize your speed advantage. Once you slow down, you're finished." Therefore, Major Brownie didn't stop. He led the convoy back to the road and continued forward, like a motorcycle gang storming into a market, creating chaos and disorder before speeding away. The motorcycles cruised smoothly along the road. The soldiers remained silent, seemingly still reeling from the battle, or perhaps unable to believe what had just happened. After a long while, someone cried out, "What did we just do? We gave the Germans a good beating, of course. Didn't you see how pathetic they were? My wheels are all red, German blood, unbelievable. We only had 200-odd men, yet we inflicted heavy casualties on over 20,000, leaving them helpless. How did this happen?" Major Brownie swallowed hard. He, too, hadn't expected this outcome. He looked around. Everyone seemed to be safe, and any losses were negligible. Incredible. This tactic really worked. Charles had succeeded again. He had created another miracle. Major Brownie paused for a moment, then pulled a map from his pocket, glanced at it, and shouted to the excited soldiers, "Hey guys, wanna try again?" Clark stumbled to his feet, staring incredulously at the scene before him. The once orderly camp was now in complete chaos. Burning tents, corpses strewn everywhere, wounded soldiers lying on the ground groaning, the survivors seemingly terrified, some sitting motionless, others still lying prone, too afraid to get up. Where was the enemy? Clark looked around, but there wasn't a trace of them. If it weren't for the devastation, Clark would have even doubted whether the enemy had been there at all. A staff officer suddenly appeared, breathing heavily and speaking in a panicked voice, "General, we've captured several enemies in their sidecar motorcycle." Clark gritted his teeth and gave the staff officer a look, signaling him to lead the way. It was an overturned sidecar motorcycle. The machine gunner's head had been smashed in the accident, and the driver had been shot on the chest and died instantly. Only the soldier in the back seat was still alive, though his right leg was broken, folded at an odd angle and pressing down on him. He lay on the ground, trembling with pain, his face pale, large beads of sweat streaming down his forehead, but dared not cry out, his eyes filled with terror as he stared at the surrounding German soldiers and the dark muzzles of their guns overhead. Kluck paid no attention to the surviving prisoner. His gaze was fixed on the upside-down, still spinning sidecar motorcycle, occasionally bending down to examine its internal structure. After a long while, he straightened up and exclaimed expressionlessly, "A brilliant design. Combining a Maxim machine gun with a motorcycle, giving it superior firepower and excellent maneuverability." Kluck seemed to understand why the covering force hadn't given any warning. These three-wheeled motorcycles must have come from mountain roads or side paths, bypassing the covering force's defenses and attacking their rear. This was it. Then, as if struck by a sudden thought, Kluck looked up in the direction the motorcycle convoy had disappeared and coldly ordered his staff, "Order the 9th Army to organize a defense. The enemy has moved in their direction." "Yes, sir." Kluck then added another order, "They might turn back." "My unit organizes a defense to the north." "Yes, sir." The troops followed orders and organized a defense to the north, leaving the rear to the logistics units to clean up the mess. The artillery set up their guns on the open ground, aiming their cannons at the road. If the enemy motorcycles reappeared, a barrage of shells would blast them into the air. "Come on, little mice, let's see where you can run now." Kluck observed the road ahead from his concealed position. However, he suddenly heard the faint sound of engines behind him. Kluck had a bad feeling. He turned around abruptly and raised his binoculars with trembling hands. Another enemy convoy? He quickly realized that this was not the case. In the aperture of his binoculars, he clearly saw a blood-stained convoy, clearly the same enemy convoy from before. Damn it, they've circled around the road. As a German general, he was ambushed twice on the same day by the same unit. And this time, the enemy was attacking his vulnerable artillery and logistics units, along with piles of shells. Chapter 43. I want to see someone. The Parisian afternoon was shrouded in a hazy gray, though elsewhere the sun might be shining. Galleri lay alone on his bed in the command post's rest room, gazing at the smog outside the window, muttering self-deprecatingly, "Unbelievable, why do the Germans like this city? What's so good about it?" Before he could finish, a sharp pain in his abdomen made him wince. It was an old wound from the Franco-German War. Galleri vaguely remembered being a second lieutenant, leading a force of 200 men armed with Chassepot rifles against the Prussians. He had been so focused on aiming at a Prussian colonel that he hadn't noticed he was also in someone else's sights. Almost simultaneously with the firing of his rifle and the fall of his target, a sharp pain shot through his abdomen, and then his body went limp, unable to rise. Galleri became a Prussian prisoner, expecting to spend the rest of his days in a POW camp, writhing in pain, as the Prussians wouldn't waste precious medicine on prisoners. But fate is a strange thing. Soon after, France surrendered, and the Prussians released prisoners according to the agreement. Galleri was one of them. He miraculously survived and rose to the rank of French lieutenant general over the next few decades. Galleri, clutching his stomach, struggled to sit up in bed, muttering to himself, "I should be thankful the Germans used cardboard-cased ammunition, otherwise, France would have lost a general." A soft knock came at the door. Galleri lowered his hand and straightened up, not wanting his men to see his weakness. "Come in." The staff officer pushed open the door, and Galleri knew from his expression that it was good news. "What? Have we made another step forward?" Galeri's tone was laced with sarcasm. Advancing with blood and lives was nothing to be proud of. Galleri even worried that the Germans were using this as a pretext to wear down the French army's manpower. However, all the officers in command were enthusiastic, and the newspapers were constantly reporting, even exaggerating, the news of the victory. "No, General," the staff officer excitedly handed the document to Galleri. "It's the 3rd Infantry Battalion of the 5th Army, the same unit that drove the Germans away in tanks. They've won another great victory." Galleri gave an O, calmly took the document, picked up his glasses from the bedside table, put them on, and asked expressionlessly, "Did they go up in tanks again? I heard they were still negotiating the purchase price of tanks." "No, General," the staff officer replied, "not tanks, but a kind of modified motorcycle." "Motorcycle?" Galleri looked at the document in his hand with suspicion. It recorded the results reported by the 5th Army. It is estimated that they killed or wounded more than 4,000 enemy soldiers, destroyed more than 40 artillery pieces, and our army only lost 23 men. Galleri read softly, his voice gradually rising in question. A mocking smile played on his lips as he turned to his staff officer, his eyes blazing with anger. "Do I look like a fool to you, Alex?" the officer stammered. "No, of course not, General. If not, why mock me with such a report?" Galleri slammed the file on the table, his voice cold. "Have we reached the point where we need to fabricate achievements to numb ourselves, General? Do you know the detrimental consequences this will have?" Galleri grew increasingly furious. He slowly rose to his feet, glaring at them. "This is shameful deception. Other units will follow suit, Alex. Everyone will be content with these false achievements and do nothing. This will ultimately lead us to collapse. No amount of troops will help, General, and you've lost your most basic judgment, actually sending me this kind of report. You've encouraged this trend. This behavior is no different from fabricating achievements. You are criminals, accomplices." Galleri was furious, his face pale. He had made up his mind to dig out everyone on this line and kick them out of the army. Only in this way could the French army possibly achieve victory, a real victory. "It's true, General," the staff officer shouted urgently. "They're using the sidecar motorcycle invented by Charles, a kind of combat motorcycle, which is why they can achieve such results with just over 200 men, like tanks." Galleri was stunned. After a long while, he asked with some doubt, "Combat motorcycle? What's that? I'm not sure." The question stumped the staff officer. "They said it's a three-wheeled motorcycle with a Maxim machine gun in the sidecar, allowing it to fight on the move. We can't believe such results either, but we've confirmed it several times, and the result is always the same." Galleri still couldn't believe it. He was silent for a while, then seemed to remember something. "You mean Charles, the boy who invented the tank?" "Yes, that's him," the staff officer suspected. What had truly shocked Galleri was Charles. If Charles could invent a tank that allowed 300 men to defy fate and win a battle they were destined to lose, then he might be able to invent another piece of equipment that could inflict heavy casualties on 200 men. "General," at that moment, another staff officer pushed open the door and reported, "The Germans have retreated. Our troops have advanced 7 kilometers, discovering a large number of artillery wreckage and corpses along the way. The Germans didn't even have time to take the bodies away." This indirectly confirmed the 3rd Infantry Battalion's victory. The artillery wreckage and corpses were irrefutable evidence. Galleri's eyes instantly lit up, his anger had vanished, replaced by ecstatic joy. This almost certainly meant that the German offensive had completely failed, and there would be no counterattack. He sat down at the table again, picked up the documents, his trembling fingers shaking frequently along with them. After watching for a while, Galleri ordered, "Alex, I need to know the whole process, the more detailed the better." "Yes, General." Just as the staff officer was about to leave, Galleri added another order, "Summon Laurent." "Yes, General." Laurent was Galleri's bodyguard. Perhaps the word bodyguard is not quite appropriate. Laurent was one of Galleri's few confidants whom he could trust without reservation. After all, even when Galleri retired, Laurent had always stayed by his side, voluntarily protecting Galleri's safety. At that time, no one could have imagined that the Germans would invade and that Galleri would be given important responsibilities again. This meant that Laurent had given up almost everything: fame, rank, high salary. Not long after, Laurent knocked and entered. "Sir, what can I do for you?" Laurent asked softly. Privately, Galleri preferred Laurent to call him sir. Galleri nodded towards the wooden door, and Laurent understood. Turning around to close the door and then walking closer to Galleri lowered his voice and said, "I want to see someone, but no one else can know." "Arrange it?" "Yes, sir," Laurent replied, a puzzled thought creeping into his mind. Given Galleri's current status, seeing someone should be a simple matter of a word. Why all the secrecy? And why couldn't anyone else know? Chapter 44 Kidnapping Incident. Charles and Dejoka led the workers through the night at the motorcycle factory. Converting the motorcycles into sidecars was one task, discussing tactics with Major Brownie was another, and restarting production at the factory was yet another. There were always unexpected issues to resolve, and time flew by. Camille visited briefly, relieved to see the two busy at the factory. Before leaving, she tenderly told Dejoka, "Charles is still young, don't overwork him." Dejoka casually agreed, then hesitated. "You don't know how capable Charles is, he has to make the decisions on many things. Trying to make things easier for him might be difficult." Hearing this, Camille felt both proud and worried. and could only smile wryly. Charles would grow up eventually, that day would come. After seeing Major Brownie and his men off in the early morning, Charles finally had time to lie down in the staff dormitory. He fell asleep immediately, only to be awakened by cheers in the afternoon. Before Charles could react, a large group of employees rushed in, including Guillaume. They shouted all at once, "We've won, Master Charles, they've won a great victory and driven the Germans back. They say they killed and wounded thousands. God, they killed more than 10 times the number of the enemy, yet their own losses were negligible. You've done a great service once again, Master Charles." Charles wasn't fully awake yet. He sat up halfway and looked at the workers in a daze. It took him a while to realize that they were talking about Major Brownie's motorcycle team. "Has there already been a battle?" Charles asked. "How is Major Brownie? Is he all right?" "He's fine," Uncle Guillaume replied. "He's the one who called. He said he wanted to thank you, Master Charles. They did as you said, and it proved very useful." Djoko walked into the dormitory, looking at the exhausted Charles with concern, and said, "Now that things have settled down, Charles, you should go home, have a good meal, and get some sleep." "I'll take care of things here," the workers chimed in. "Yes, Master Charles, go back and rest, we'll take care of things here. We've called another group of workers to take over the shift. We'll be going to rest in a little while too." Charles felt there was nothing he needed to do here. The main thing was that drowsiness was still washing over him like waves, so he readily accepted the suggestion. Walking down the streets of the small town, the setting sun cast a long, lingering shadow beside him. Unaccustomed to staying up late, Charles felt as if he were in another world, and his steps were even a little unsteady. Unbeknownst to him, someone seemed to be approaching. Turning his head, he saw 2 middle-aged men in black suits and top hats, flanking him on either side. "Young Master Charles," the man on the left with a mustache asked, turning his head. "And you are?" Charles asked, puzzled. The next second, Charles realized his mistake. If they were there to kidnap him, this simple response would confirm their identity. "Someone wants to see you, young Master Charles," the man with a mustache gestured towards a car parked a short distance ahead, speaking in a commanding tone. "Come with us." Without further ado, the 2 men grabbed Charles and led him towards the car. Charles was instantly terrified, breaking out in a cold sweat, his mind completely clearing. Was it really a kidnapping? A demand for money? Or assassins sent by capitalists? Running into them here meant they had been lying in wait outside the motorcycle factory for a long time, and he just happened to be alone. What to do? In the nick of time, a childish cry rang out, "Murderer! Bad guys! They're going to kidnap Master Charles." It was Teddy's voice. Charles was so moved he wanted to hug Teddy's chubby face and kiss him. All the bad memories of him vanished instantly, and his chubby, wasteless appearance was transformed into something adorable. The 2 men in suits paused at the sound of the cry. They seemed to want to protest, but after exchanging a glance, they said nothing and quickened their pace. This seemed to confirm Teddy's belief that they were bad guys, and he shouted even louder, "They're sent by the capitalists to kidnap Charles, help! Save Master Charles." As Charles was being forced into the car, neighbors rushed over from all directions, shouting. The baker held a dinner knife, the worker held a wrench, the woman held a kitchen knife and eggs, and Aunt Cara even held a long rolling pin used for making pizzas. "Stop them, don't let them get away. They want to take young Master Charles away, these despicable bastards. They actually dare to kidnap young Master Charles right under our noses. Are they courting death?" Seeing the situation was turning against them, the 2 men in suits desperately dragged Charles onto the already started car. Just as they were about to drive off, Uncle Anthony, who had arrived, grabbed them both and pulled them down. Uncle Anthony was a bricklayer. He was burly and thick-shouldered, carrying a 50-kilogram bag of lime on his back, and he ran without even breaking a sweat. He remained calm, spreading his hands to stop the other neighbors who were about to rush over, and turned his questioning gaze to Charles. "Do you know them, young Master Charles?" "No, I don't know them," Charles answered truthfully. This immediately confirmed the charge of kidnapping. Uncle Anthony loosened his grip like a fence, and the angry neighbors surged forward like a tidal wave. They brandished various weapons at the men in suits, hitting and cursing as they went, seemingly venting all their anger on them. "Kill them, you inhuman bastards, damn capitalists, they can't stand to see others do well. Young Master Charles must have blocked their path to wealth. They're trying to kill him." They must have stolen my chickens too. The two men in suits cried out, trying to explain, but the neighbors wouldn't listen. They rushed forward, smashing car windows. Bang! A gunshot rang out. The neighbors gasped and involuntarily stumbled back a few steps. Uncle Anthony immediately shielded Charles behind him. However, the neighbors only hesitated for a moment before immediately surrounding them again. They outnumbered the man, who only had a revolver. How many could they kill? But they were too late. Two men in suits seized the opportunity, quickly climbed into the car, and slammed on the gas. The car sped through the crowd amidst a deafening horn blare. Neighbors gave chase, pelting the car with stones, spitting, and curses. Several women's shoes flew through the air in graceful arcs, striking the driver squarely in the face. Charles, Carmi came running frantically from the other end of the street, pale-faced and terrified, her apron still undone. Clearly, a neighbor had rushed to tell her everything. "I'm all right, Mom." Charles emerged from the crowd to greet her. Carmi breathed a sigh of relief upon seeing Charles. She slowed her pace and hugged him tightly, then burst into tears of joy. After a moment, she remembered the neighbors, looked up, and thanked them all, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Thank you all. Thank you so much, thanks to you all." Chapter 45. Seeing you is not an easy thing. Charles was escorted home surrounded by his neighbors. Teddy instantly became a hero, showered with praise, and the beautiful Mrs. Chatham even kissed his plump face. Charles felt a pang of jealousy at Teddy's smug expression. It wasn't fair. Wasn't he the one who was terrified and about to be kidnapped? He was the one who needed comforting more. Just as Charles arrived home, Joka, having received the news, rushed back. Camille angrily shoved Joka, blaming him for Charles's peril, believing that this wouldn't have happened if Charles hadn't returned alone. Charles, however, felt that even with Joka present, nothing would have changed. They had guns, both of them. What could Joka do? However, Charles had a nagging feeling that this might be a misunderstanding. If it were assassins sent by capitalists or someone else to harm him, they wouldn't have been so obvious. They were wearing custom-made suits and high-quality ties, clearly expensive, which would be conspicuous in the not-so-wealthy town of Darwas. Moreover, after confirming Charles's identity, they could have easily shot him and jumped into the car to escape. Dragging him into the car was completely unnecessary. If they were low-level kidnappers after ransom, they should have worn sunglasses and turned up their coat collars to avoid being recognized. But they didn't. As darkness fell, Charles, exhausted and frightened after a long day, didn't plan to go to the factory that night, and Camille wouldn't allow him to. He hastily ate some bread to fill his stomach, took a shower, changed into his pajamas, and hurriedly hid under the covers. Perhaps due to adrenaline, Charles, who had been incredibly sleepy just moments before, was now unusually awake, tossing and turning in bed, unable to fall asleep. Joka and Camille sat worriedly at the dining table. They had been concerned about this matter, but they hadn't shown it to Charles. They might come back. Camille's eyes gleamed with inexplicable fear. "And we don't even know who they are." "Don't worry, Camille," Joka reassured him. "I'll stay by Charles's side from now on, I swear." Camille nodded, but his heart was still pounding with anxiety. Those people were lurking in the shadows. They would always find an opportunity to harm Charles unless he never left the house again. Just then, the faint sound of barking dogs came from outside, followed by the flashes of car headlights and the approaching roar of engines. A car pulled up in the darkness and stopped outside. The atmosphere instantly became tense. Joka gestured for Camille to be quiet, and he cautiously walked to the window and peeked outside. When he saw several dark figures getting out of the car and walking towards them, he decisively turned around, grabbed a double-barreled shotgun from the wall, and pulled out a drawer to retrieve the ammunition. While frantically reloading, he commanded Camille in an unwavering voice, "Upstairs, keep an eye on Charles." Camille, terrified, instantly drained of color. She covered her mouth, trying to stifle a scream, and stumbled down the stairs, only to find Charles at the other end. "Father," Charles said calmly, trying to stop Joka's overreaction. "They might not be bad people, otherwise, it's impossible for only 3 people to have entered the town." Joka was taken aback. He thought Charles might be right. The neighbors had only come to help that afternoon. If these 3 were here to cause trouble, it was tantamount to suicide. However, Joka remained vigilant. Gripping his gun, he leaned against the doorframe, turned his head, and shouted, "Who are you? What brings you here?" None of the three answered. One of them stepped forward and whispered, "Mr. Joka, General Galini wants to speak with Charles." Joka's eyes widened instantly. He couldn't believe his ears. General Galini? He wanted to see Charles? Joka, still somewhat skeptical, turned and peered through the crack in the door. Although the dim light obscured the man's face, the elderly man leaning on a cane exuded an air of authority, which made Joka more convinced. After a moment's hesitation, Joka unlocked the door and carefully opened it a crack. When the light shone on the old man's face, Joka finally saw him clearly. He exclaimed and opened the door, "General Galini, it really is you. It's a great honor." "Excuse me, General, please come in." General Galini didn't move. He glanced suspiciously at the hunting rifle in Joka's hand. Joka jolted awake, quickly unloaded the rifle, placed it on the table, and explained, "Sorry, General, we thought you were bad guys." General Galini raised an eyebrow. "My guards already had their say this afternoon." Joka instantly realized the kidnapping was a misunderstanding. Looking at the two men following Galini, bruised and embarrassed, they were clearly the two suspects who had been beaten up. Camille, upstairs protecting Charles, hadn't heard what was being said and even thought Joka had been forced to put down his gun. Trembling with fear, she pulled Charles to hide. "That's General Galini, Mom," Charles comforted Camille. "It's all right, it's a misunderstanding." Charles had seen Galini's picture in the newspaper and recognized him immediately, despite him being in civilian clothes. "Galien? No, how could Galine?" At that moment, Galine entered the room. Under the lamplight, he removed his hat and handed it to the person beside him. Camille immediately recognized him and exclaimed, "My God, it really is him, General Galine." How could he?" General Galine glanced upstairs and politely nodded to Camille and Charles. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Bernard, and Charles, I hope what happened this afternoon didn't frighten you. My men aren't very good at handling these kinds of things." This sudden turn of events left Camille bewildered, or perhaps she couldn't believe that such an important figure as Galine would suddenly appear before her. She stared blankly until Charles tugged at her sleeve, jolting her awake. "No, General, of course, no," she stammered nervously. "It is our honor, we are fine." Charles shrugged. She had almost jumped out the window to escape just now. "You must be Charles." Galeri's gaze locked onto Charles, his steady tone tinged with a hint of inquiry. "May I speak with you?" "Of course, General." Charles descended the stairs. Just then, a neighbor called out, "Is everything all right, Mr. Joka?" Clearly, the neighbors had also noticed the commotion. Worried the visitor might be a bad guy, they had called out to inquire. They, like Joka, had even prepared and loaded their shotguns, and there were more than one. "Everything's fine," Joka quickly leaned out the window to reply, then hesitated slightly before adding, "Their clients, Daniel. They're here to discuss business." The neighbors were relieved. "Just call if you need anything, Joka. We're always here." "Okay," Joka thanked them. Galeri raised an eyebrow helplessly, giving Charles a self-deprecating smile as he came downstairs. "Seeing you isn't easy, Charles. I've risked my life." Chapter 46 The Despicable Middleman. The commoner's house lacked a dedicated living room or study for conversation, so Camille hurriedly cleared a dining table, which hadn't yet been set up, and used it as a reception area. Charles sized up Galeri. He was a man who didn't care much about his appearance, his glasses perched unevenly on his nose, a bushy, graying mustache, and an ill-fitting suit. He looked like a scruffy, frail old man, making it hard to imagine that he was one of France's most militarily talented generals. Before Charles and Joka could speak, Galeri interjected, "You must be wondering why I am speaking to you secretly, right?" Joka nodded, but Charles remained calm. Galeri was somewhat surprised by Charles's reaction. He asked, "Have you already guessed? You don't want those capitalists who control the Senate to know," Charles replied. "Clever boy," Galeri smiled slightly. "No wonder you invented the tank and the sidecar. If I'm not mistaken, Major Brownie's tactics were taught to him by you, weren't they?" Charles didn't deny it. He could fool others, but he couldn't fool Galeri. Joka hesitated, looking at Charles, unsure whether to tell Galeri about luring the Germans to Daza. Charles said, "That didn't escape the general's notice either, father. He knows it was us." Galeri was initially puzzled, but soon realized, "You lured the Germans here, exposing their flanks to us? I'd only suspected it all along. I never imagined it really was you." "It was Charles, General," Joka said, "It was all Charles's idea." Gallery looked at Charles, his eyes brimming with unreserved admiration. "A brilliant idea, Charles. I never imagined it could be like this, especially spreading rumors that made the Germans think Paris was a ghost town. It fooled everyone. If Kluck knew he'd been defeated by a child, I wonder what his reaction would be." "I'm 17, General," Charles protested. Gallery chuckled. After all, he was just a child. He even wished he were older, so that when he reached Gallery's age, he would know how wonderful youth was. Gallery's gaze towards Charles gradually softened, and his tone shifted from formal to casual. "Let's get back to the point, kid. You must have heard about the tanks, right? After you sold the tank industrial rights to Greevy, they used this war to hold the military hostage, and the military is still in tense negotiations with them." Joka was getting anxious. "We had no choice but to do this, General." "I know," Gallery interrupted Joka. "Don't misunderstand, Mr. Joka. I don't mean to interrogate you. The industrial rights are yours. You're free to sell them to whomever you want, and I have no right to interfere. I just want to see if we can solve this problem." "What problem?" Joka was a little confused. Gallery didn't answer directly. He calmly pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, took out two, and placed them on either side of the table. He said, "This is you, this is the army. The army needs tanks, you produce tanks. It's a simple buyer-seller relationship between us." However, Gallery placed the cigarette pack in the middle and tapped it with his fingers. "The Senate is in the way, gentlemen. The military's procurement requires the Senate's permission. You can't directly contact the military, and that's where the problems arise. Efficiency, price, quality, time, everything is problematic, yet we have no choice but to buy. You, too, are forced to sell due to pressure from all sides, even being forced to sell industrial property rights." Joka exclaimed, "Oh. Those capitalists who control the Senate, they forcefully use the system to become middlemen, profiting from the difference." He suddenly understood why Gallery, as a general, had to secretly meet with Charles. This wasn't a simple meeting, it was bypassing the middlemen to contact the sellers directly. This touched the middlemen's cake, their fundamental interests. If the capitalists found out about this, they might orchestrate a real kidnapping of Charles. "That's exactly it," General Gallery nodded. "This forces us to buy inferior equipment at several times the price, and sometimes we miss opportunities because of disagreements over price. For example, the army can't get tanks now unless we agree to buy them at 6,000 francs each." This price startled Joka and Charles. The first-generation tanks were nothing more than tractors welded with steel plates and a machine gun, costing only a little over 1,000 francs, yet the capitalists were selling them to the military for 6,000 francs. This was clearly exploiting the urgency of the war to blackmail the military and make a fortune. General Gallery said coldly, "They've kidnapped the future identity of France, as well as the lives of soldiers and civilians, to achieve their goal of embezzling tax revenue." How despicable! Joka, though aware of the capitalists' ruthlessness, was indignant that they would resort to such despicable means to profit from national crisis. "Why can't they allow the army to procure goods independently?" he cried. "Because they believe the army shouldn't have too much power," Gallery explained. "Once the army has power, it's easy for them to control the country." Joka fell silent. This was a convenient excuse for the capitalists. Charles asked, "General, what can we do? We can't change the status quo." "You're right, young man," Gallery nodded approvingly. "If you're a greedy capitalist like them, then there's nothing we can do. Because once the army privately negotiates a price with you, the capitalists can always use their power to stop the deal and offer you double or even triple the price. Therefore, the military always loses in the bidding war with the capitalists, without exception." Charles nodded in understanding. "The money capitalists use isn't their own, it's the French treasury, taxpayers' money. The military's meager budget can't possibly compete with it, but if a capitalist has a conscience, the situation is different." Gallery's deep gaze fixed on Charles. He must resist the temptation of the high prices offered by capitalists, choosing to deal with the military even if it means earning less, and forming a long-term partnership, even an alliance. In other words, he must stand with the military against capitalist control. "Can you do that?" Joka's expression was somewhat strange. "A businessman's goal is to make money, the highest bidder wins, that's a matter of course, a market principle." But now Gallery was demanding they break this market principle and choose the military, which offered a lower price. This was what Francis saw as foolishness. Galeri's gaze never left Charles. He had conducted extensive research on Charles beforehand, knowing that Charles used his own funds to help field hospitals aid the wounded. He believed Charles was a capitalist with a conscience, otherwise he wouldn't have made this trip. Charles paused for a moment, then asked, "General, can you solve the military's problem? I mean, how can you bypass the Senate's control and procure independently?" Galeni answered decisively, "Wartime contingency regulations stipulate that the military has the right to choose equipment during wartime. We have the right to choose better equipment." Galeni then added, "Of course, the prerequisite is better." Chapter 47 Wartime Procurement Regulations. Wartime emergency procurement regulations were actually a response to capitalists' fear of overstepping their bounds. For example, if the Germans were advancing victoriously towards Paris, and capitalists continued their insatiable pressure on the military to purchase equipment at exorbitant prices, while the military was unable to afford it, the end result would be the entire country being occupied by the Germans, resulting in utter devastation and nothing gained. This was clearly not in the capitalists' interest. To avoid this situation, capitalists finally had a change of heart and realized they should exercise restraint during wartime, otherwise, it would benefit no one. Therefore, they delegated some authority to the military. In short, Galeri calmly put away the cigarettes on the table, placing them back in the pack. If the military has a need and the Senate can't provide alternatives, they have no right to interfere with the military's purchases. Galeri looked up at the two men, reminding them, "For example, your sidecar motorcycle is currently unique, and we clearly have a need for it. It has even proven useful in actual combat. I can include it in the wartime procurement regulations and bypass the Senate to purchase it directly." Djoka's eyes lit up instantly. This meant an order from the military, and it was likely a large one. However, Charles grasped the key point in Galeri's words, "Currently unique? What if it isn't in the future?" Galeri fell silent. As expected of Charles, he could grasp the crucial point in the shortest amount of time. Reminded by Charles, Djoka immediately realized that this was the most important thing. "General, can you guarantee our rights?" Djokovic elaborated, "I mean industrial property rights. Capitalists can easily bypass or copy them, and we can't do anything about it. This forces us to sell our property rights." "No, I can't." Galeni shook his head. At this time, there was a consensus in France: if the military also held political power, they were no different from emperors, which could easily overthrow the republic and restore the monarchy. They advocated the separation of powers and checks and balances. Therefore, politics was a no-go zone for the military. They could not get involved. Then, Djoka compromised: "If counterfeits appear, can you guarantee that you will purchase our products?" Galeni hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "No, I can't." Djoka glanced at Charles, then turned to Galeni, his face full of difficulty. "General, although we would like to support you, we cannot guarantee our rights and sales, yet we are asked to guarantee low prices. In this situation, we may not be able to survive, so, this may not be realistic." Galeni replied calmly, "If counterfeits appear, we can apply for testing. I'll take the Hotchkiss machine gun as an example. The specific process is roughly like this: we apply to the government, requesting a comparison of the Hotchkiss and St. Etienne machine guns from all aspects. The government randomly selects soldiers from the army to operate the two machine guns in various environments, and finally obtains the test data." At this moment, Camille came up with a tray, serving everyone a cup of still steaming coffee. This surprised Djoka and Charles, as their family did not have the habit of drinking coffee. Occasionally, when they wanted some, they would buy it from the small shop in Osset across the street. Galeni thanked him, and after Camille left, he continued, "Once we conclude that the Hotchkiss machine gun is superior to the St. Etienne machine gun, the military can reject the Senate's proposal to equip us with a St. Etienne machine gun and instead equip us with a Hotchkiss." Galeni picked up his coffee, blew on it gently, and looked up at Charles, a hint of embarrassment in his eyes. "All I can do is ensure that every piece of your equipment is included in the wartime procurement regulations." Charles sorted out his thoughts. He understood Galeni's idea: if someone copies it, let them copy it. The copying will inevitably involve some redundant designs to circumvent intellectual property rights, just like the St. Etienne machine gun, resulting in a counterfeit that is largely useless. Then, simply comparing and testing the genuine product and the copy in the wartime procurement regulations will allow the genuine product to defeat the copy and legitimately enter the army. After a moment's thought, Charles asked again, But capitalists have more advanced equipment and more abundant funds. What if their imitations are better than our genuine products? Galleri smiled slightly. Of course we'll choose the better one. We are the army, Charles. The army only cares about results, that's reality. So what if it's the genuine product? If it's defeated by the imitation, it just means the imitation has taken a step further. And the army operates on the jungle law of survival of the fittest, especially in wartime. General, Charles said again, so, it seems the military hasn't done anything. If our product is better, you should have included it in your procurement list and compared it with the imitation, am I right? No, Galleri shook his head, a hint of helplessness in his eyes. It's not as simple as you think, Charles. The Hotchkiss machine gun was included in the wartime procurement list thanks to my efforts. Charles was taken aback, then nodded. Galleri wasn't the only one in the military. Its high command had been thoroughly infiltrated by capitalists, to the point that they were practically a community of interests, colluding with them. This was the main reason why the Saint Etienne machine gun, such a poorly designed piece of equipment, was so prevalent in the army. Galleri was an outlier in the military. He strived to improve the army and make it more combat effective. In peacetime, this outlier would have been ousted by the capitalists long ago, just as he had reluctantly chosen to retire. It's ironic that the military finds it so difficult to acquire better equipment, even though it's already in production and within reach, and the soldiers want to use it in combat, yet they are blocked by the capitalists. Galleri glanced at their expressions and seemed to understand. He nodded silently. I know this is a bit unreasonable, Mr. Joka and Mr. Charles, it's unfair to you. I'm asking you to ignore the high price offered by the capitalists, and all we can offer in exchange is a wartime procurement regulation, but that's all I can do. If you refuse, I completely understand. After all, if it were me, I might make the same choice. So, Galleri spread his hands. It's a pleasure to meet you. He stood up to shake hands and say goodbye. But Charles said, I think we can continue the discussion, General. Let's discuss a price that's acceptable to both sides. What? Galleri and Joka exclaimed in unison, casting shocked glances at Charles. Chapter 48 Power or Money? Ultimately, Charles chose to cooperate with Galleri. Galleri left satisfied, instructing Joka and Charles before departing, we didn't meet, I didn't make any promises or agreements, we don't know each other, understand, of course, Joka and Charles replied in unison. If the capitalists knew of this tacit understanding, those in power would launch a frenzied retaliation. They might even accuse Galleri of endangering national security. As a soldier, Galleri, bypassing the Senate to secretly reach agreements with arms dealers, was he plotting a coup to overthrow the Republic? Double standards and manipulating the law are capitalists' forte. No one can outmaneuver them in this regard. Galleri glanced worriedly at the kitchen, where Camille was busy cutting fruit. Joka understood. Don't worry, General. She won't say anything, I guarantee it. It wasn't that Camille was tight-lipped, but that Joka knew her weakness. Galleri was somewhat relieved after receiving assurances. He shook hands with both men and said to Charles with a touch of emotion, besides inventing equipment, you're also a natural strategist and tactician, Charles. I once hoped you would become my advisor, but, you know, Charles expressed his understanding. His identity as an arms dealer was too sensitive for the military, touching a raw nerve for capitalists. I'm sorry, General, Charles said. What? Galleri was confused by Charles's sudden apology. Charles explained, I might curse you a few times or express my dissatisfaction with you in the future. I hope you won't mind. Galleri was taken aback, then burst into laughter. Of course I won't mind, Charles, the harsher the better. I approve of your insults. Of course, I'll respond in kind, and I don't think you'll mind either, of course, General. And another thing, Galleri patted Charles on the shoulder, I've always believed you're a capitalist with a conscience, and I wasn't wrong. Joka was somewhat confused. He understood every word of the old man and young man's cryptic conversation, but he didn't know what they were talking about. After seeing Galleri off, Joka suddenly understood. To avoid suspicion, the military needed to appear to be at odds with Charles, this arms dealer, or at least to dislike each other, so that the capitalist would feel at ease. Joka felt somewhat dejected. The conversation between these intelligent people seemed irrelevant to him. He felt somewhat superfluous. Just then, Camille came out excitedly carrying a plate. She couldn't find Galleri, and her face showed some regret and disappointment. Has the general left? He should have tried my apple tarts. The general is busy, Camille, Joka said. Charles cast a questioning look at Joka, as if asking, how are you going to shut Camille up and stop her from bragging to the neighbors about tonight's events? Joka shrugged. That's easy, isn't it? Camille, Joka called to her as she was about to return to the kitchen. There's something I need to emphasize. What? Camille turned around, wiping her hands on her apron. General Gallieri didn't come, Joka said. Those who came tonight were just clients, here to talk business, and only business. But, Joka interrupted Camille's question, if the capitalists know what happened tonight, they might harm Charles, and a kidnapping could actually happen. That's one of the reasons why General Gallieri came to see Charles in plain clothes. Camille instantly turned pale with fright. She looked at Charles and then nodded heavily. Okay, I won't say a word. Those who came tonight were clients, they just want to buy motorcycles. Yes, Joka nodded in satisfaction. Charles protested with his eyes, you shamelessly using me. Joka replied helplessly, this is the best way, Charles. You are Camille's weakness. Once she knows this, she'll keep her mouth shut even in her dreams. Charles did not object. This seemed to be a common trait among most mothers. Joka led Charles back to the table to enjoy a fruit platter. As he ate, he asked 2 questions. He can't protect our industrial property rights, so how do we deal with the capitalists' imitations for secrecy? Joka had replaced Galini with him. That's not a problem, father. Charles rummaged through the platter with his fork, picking out his favorite apples. If I can continuously update our equipment and improve its performance, the capitalists' imitations will always be one step behind. They'll only produce things that are obsolete. Whoever imitates will lose money. Joka paused, looking at Charles quietly for a while before saying, it seems you're very confident in yourself. Of course, Charles replied half-jokingly, I have at least 100 ideas in my head, I just haven't had time to implement them yet. Joka smiled and continued what he was doing. After all, he was still a minor, he didn't understand the harsh realities of life. Sometimes, even if you have ideas, they might not be accepted by society or the military. However, Joka didn't point it out. He thought it was a good thing for Charles to maintain this confidence and mindset. There was no need to add extra pressure. What Joka didn't know was that Charles truly had 100 ideas, and these ideas had been tested by society in actual combat, ensuring they would be accepted by the military. Another question, Joka continued, why choose to cooperate with the military even at a lower price? Merchants shouldn't do that, at least Francis wouldn't make that choice. Yes, Charles crunched on an apple, answering vaguely, mid to lower level merchants certainly wouldn't. Mid to lower level, Joka was taken aback. Could it be that Francis, hailed as a business genius in the family, was merely a mid to lower level merchant in Charles's eyes? Mid to lower level merchants only ever see money. Charles focused on his food, answering casually, their vision is blinded by money, making them unable to see what's more important things. Joka felt Charles was talking about himself. He didn't know what was more important either. Instead of answering, Charles asked, Father, do you know who the most powerful capitalists in France are? I do know some. Joka hesitated for a moment before naming several well-known names in France, Wendell, Steed, Jameson, and Wells. Charles nodded, pointing out their identities one by one. The Wendell family controls the Wendell Group, monopolizing 1/5 of France's steel production. Steed owns the Saint-Étienne arsenal, which practically monopolizes the production and manufacturing of small arms for the French army. Jameson owns the Schneider arsenal, producing artillery and warships, and Wells is the head of the Brest shipyard, which has been producing warships for France since the last century. Joka hummed in agreement. It seemed Charles had put in the effort in this regard. Charles looked up at Joka. Do you think this is a coincidence, father? The most powerful people control the French army's arms manufacturing. Before Joka could answer, Charles added several more questions. Did they become the most powerful people because they controlled arms manufacturing, or did they control arms manufacturing after becoming the most powerful people? If the latter, where did their power come from? Who gave it to them? Joka was stunned. He had never thought about these questions before. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 49 Power comes from this. They control the lifeline of France, father, Charles explained. Steel, rifles, cannons, and warships, they are all indispensable. If these capitalists simply close their factories or refuse to sell, France is finished, Djoka nodded thoughtfully. That's where the power comes from. No one dares offend them, because they can decide the life or death of France. Yes, Charles said. They are the upper-class merchants who set the rules, and the middle and lower-class merchants can only make money under the rules. They don't realize that the upper-class merchants with power can wipe out the middle and lower-class merchants with just a word. So, is money really that important? Power is what protects your money. You can even use power to steal other people's money. If you have money but no power, you can only watch others take it away. Djoka thought Charles made sense. He had guessed that Charles wanted to carve a piece of the power pie from the capitalists, but he hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. After a moment's hesitation, Djoka asked doubtfully, "But the military's power is very limited, Charles. They don't even interfere in politics." "That's not important, father," Charles replied. "What's important is that the military protects France. Capitalists control the military by selling arms, and thus control France. That's what those big capitalists you mentioned did. The Wendell family, for example, weren't arms dealers. They controlled steel, an indispensable raw material for military industry, as well as civilian industries. Therefore, the French government could only grant them privileges with a friendly demeanor." Charles finally put down his fork, patted his round belly, and concluded, "Although we earn less money cooperating with the military, it's the only way for us to gain power, and perhaps our only chance." Djoka didn't quite understand, but he realized Charles was right. A typical counterexample was the traditional nobles of Greville. Although they were wealthy, they had been marginalized on the political stage and had little influence, which might be one of the reasons they were so desperate to buy the tank ownership. Charles didn't elaborate further. He wasn't being secretive or trying to be mysterious, rather, some things were beyond Djoka's comprehension. At this time, capitalists practically monopolized everything in the military, from uniforms and rifles to artillery and warships, except for two almost entirely undeveloped areas, armored vehicles like tanks and aircraft. It wasn't that the capitalists didn't want to handle these, rather, these areas hadn't been developed yet. They didn't realize the future potential of these two fields, nor did they know how they would develop, or how important they were. If Charles focused on rifles, he would become an enemy of the Saint Etienne armory. Developing artillery would steal business from Schneider. Developing warships would infringe on the interests of the Brest shipyard. Whichever choice he made would escalate conflicts with the major capitalists, and a war without gunfire would immediately erupt. With Charles's current strength, none of these major capitalists were people he could afford to offend. He could easily orchestrate a traffic accident and kill him. But if Charles were to focus on tanks, armored vehicles, and aircraft, then there would be no enemies or competitors. The big capitalists would at most consider purchasing the intellectual property rights or whether to follow suit and start copying. This is one of the reasons why Charles has remained unscathed to this day. So, is it important to sell at a lower price and make less money? What's important is cooperating with the military to promote tanks, aircraft, and various armored vehicles under the Charles name, making the military and even France indispensable. One day, if Charles were to close its factory doors, France might perish. What could the big capitalists do then? Eliminate Charles and take everyone down with them? From this perspective, General Gallieri misunderstood Charles. He thought Charles agreed to his plan and cooperate with the military because of conscience. Of course, there was an element of conscience and self-preservation, but more importantly, Charles was unwilling to be a pawn in the hands of big capitalists. He wanted to become a true tycoon and a player in the game. Perhaps sensing Charles's ambition, Djoka felt somewhat displeased. Charles might not genuinely want to help the people and soldiers. He might want to use them as bargaining chips in his fight against the capitalists. But upon reflection, Djoka felt it was understandable. This was a dog-eat-dog world. Unless one was content to remain at the bottom and be exploited by big capitalists for life, the only option was to fight one's way up. Any hesitation or soft-heartedness would lead to failure and an endless wait for advancement. It could even be considered self-preservation. Thinking this, Djoka felt relieved and nodded firmly. "Like I said, I will always stand by your side." The next morning, Djoka, as a guardian, went to Paris to apply for industrial property rights for the sidecar motorcycle, accompanied by Guillaume and several other workers. This was Charles's idea. Many parts and ideas for the sidecar motorcycle came from the workers, Charles said, for example, the shock absorbers, the triangular machine gun support. We should protect their rights, Joker readily agreed. He was a sentimental and gentlemanly man, always readily agreeing to such requests and deeply gratified by Charles's compassion for the workers. In this respect, he was indeed not well suited for business. Charles did this for several reasons. First, it could stimulate the workers' enthusiasm and creativity. All their inventions were their own, creating wealth for themselves, so naturally they would be more willing to invent rather than hide them as before. Second, it could attract talent from other factories. Other factories and capitalists would plunder the workers' intellectual property rights, while Charles protected their rights and even actively helped them apply for them. Naturally, talented people would be more willing to work for Charles. Third, and most importantly, it could tie the workers' fate to Charles's. If one day, capitalists were to imitate the sidecar motorcycle, it wouldn't just be Charles's problem, they would also be taking away from the workers' livelihoods, because the workers' intellectual property rights would also be infringed upon by capitalists. At that point, Charles wouldn't even need to intervene, the workers would spontaneously organize marches and protests, and the scale of the demonstrations might be far greater than Charles's own. Why not gain so many benefits for a small expense? Charles's approach was remarkably effective. The factory remained unattended for the entire day. While key personnel like Djokovic and Guillaume had gone to Paris, everyone else worked diligently, even resuming motorcycle production. The factory operated on its own in an incredible manner. Charles didn't go to the factory either, Camille kept him locked up at home. Wait for your father to return, Camille's tone was resolute. Otherwise, you're not going anywhere. Charles tried several times to persuade Camille, but to no avail. She was generally indecisive, but in this matter, she displayed an unexpectedly unwavering stubbornness. Frustrated, Charles could only lie idly in bed, flipping through his textbooks, wondering if school should reopen. After all, the Germans had been driven back and their chance for a counterattack was gone. Then Charles thought, his classmates, around his age, were about to turn 18, and they might be heading to the battlefield next year. What would be the point of returning to school? Chapter 50 Improvisation. Unbeknownst to Charles, the Joker was engaged in a fierce battle with Gallieri when registering industrial property rights in Paris. Gallieri acted swiftly, as he told his staff, the Germans are retreating, gentlemen. We urgently need sidecars to catch up with the Germans, not tanks that can stop bullets. This is urgent, because given just a few days, the enemy can build a defensive line that our sidecars cannot cross. Therefore, Gallieri submitted his application to purchase sidecars to the government early the next morning and followed up on the entire process. The process went smoothly, thanks to the uniqueness of sidecars. Even Charles was the only manufacturer of motorcycles, so Gallieri's application was soon approved, granting him, on behalf of the military, the independent right to purchase sidecars. Then, upon learning that De Joker had applied for industrial property rights at the City Hall, Gallieri immediately went to discuss the purchase of the sidecars. We might need $2,000 or even more. You should lower the price, Mr. Joker. No, General, Joker refused decisively, 800 francs each, not a single soldier less. That's already very cheap. Cheap? Do you think I'm a fool? Gallieni gritted his teeth, tapping the table with his finger excitedly. A sedan only costs 900 francs, sir. You're selling sidecars for almost the same price as sedans. You can buy a sedan, General. Joker stood firm. It's expensive because it's worth the money. Nothing can replace it, including sedans. Joker was telling the truth. The sedan's passability and off-road capability couldn't compare to the sidecar, and the sedan's engine was positioned far forward, making it a large target. A single bullet could cripple it on the battlefield. I know motorcycles only cost 220 francs. You just added a sidecar to it, so it'll be at most 300 francs. The point is, only we have them, General, De Joker emphasized smugly. If you're not satisfied with the price, I suggest you go ask somewhere else. Gallieni was furious. Do you know what kind of behavior this is, sir? You're ignoring the safety of your soldiers, ignoring the dangers your army faces on the battlefield, and ignoring the plight of France. I am a member of France, General, De Joker retorted, listing the good deeds he had done. We paid out of our own pockets to raise food for the French army, invented tanks to help France win this war, helped the wounded in the field hospital, and even donated 100 sidecars to the military to repel the Germans who were trying to counterattack. And you dare accuse me of ignoring the army? Ignoring the soldiers, and ignoring France, Gallieni retorted, then you shouldn't be raising the price of the sidecar to 800 francs at this crucial moment. That price will ruin all the good reputation you've earned. You're no different from those unscrupulous merchants now. Alright, Joka conceded, 700 francs, no less, still too expensive. We need a considerable sum. After a heated exchange, General Gallieni finally managed to bring the price down to 550 francs. This was all an act. 550 francs was the price Charles and Gallieni had agreed upon the previous night. The sidecar's cost was approximately 270 francs, and Gallieni, perhaps to compensate Charles, offered a purchase price of 800 francs. This is acceptable to the military, Gallieni said. It's much better than capitalists making 4 or 5 times the profit. Joka's eyes lit up instantly. The profit was considerable, 530 francs per sidecar, 1,000 vehicles would be over 500,000 francs, and the military's purchase volume was definitely more than 1,000 vehicles. This was much more profitable than selling industrial property rights. However, Charles considered for a moment and said, 550 francs per vehicle, what? Gallieni felt this was unreal. Charles, Joka thought he had misheard. Charles turned to Joka and said, too much profit will bring us a lot of trouble, father. Joka was confused. Merchants only worry about too little profit, not too much? Charles analyzed, if the profit of a sidecar motorcycle reaches 530 francs, capitalists will definitely be eager to try it. They can import motorcycles from overseas and modify them into sidecar motorcycles to compete with us. Even though this requires transportation costs and high import prices, they can still make money. Joka suddenly realized, if we lower the price to 550 francs, the profit will be compressed to 280 francs. They won't be able to import motorcycles to compete with us because they simply won't make any money. Yes, Charles's voice was still young, but his tone and actions were quite mature. In addition, if capitalists want to imitate, they must build a factory and a production line in France, and finally, they must bypass our industrial property rights. With such a small profit margin, after considering all factors, they may choose to give up rather than follow suit and become our competitors. Brilliant strategy, Charles, Gallieni praised. Now I know where your strategic and tactical talents come from. The marketplace is simply another battlefield. The price of 550 francs was thus set. The next morning, what happened at the Paris City Hall was not prearranged. Joka and Gallieni put on an impromptu performance. Parisians are well informed, and the big capitalists would soon find out, thinking, that's just how Gallieni is. This fool always argues with the capitalists over the military's money. A sidecar motorcycle for only 550 francs? That good for nothing Joka. He's cutting off everyone's livelihood. At the Ritz Hotel in Place Vendôme, in the heart of Paris, in a luxurious meeting room, Francis leisurely enjoyed his favorite Algerian coffee, smiling as he looked at the military representative sitting opposite him, casually lighting a cigar. Francis was responsible for negotiating the tank price with the military. He had been pushed to the negotiating table by Grevy to mislead others into believing that the tank ownership still belonged to Charles. Grevy promised Francis a 1% commission. Francis had calculated, one tank could sell for 6,000 francs, so 1,500 tanks would be 9 million, meaning his commission would be 90,000 francs. The military representative, looking anxious, sighed helplessly, Mr. Francis, we find it difficult to accept a unit price of 6,000 francs. If you could. Francis didn't even bother to reply. He simply waved his still smoking cigar, indicating there was no possibility of lowering the price. It's not me who's anxious, it's you, Francis thought. Every minute he waited here meant countless soldiers would die because of the lack of tanks. That was his bargaining chip. At that moment, a communications soldier entered. He glanced at Francis, then leaned over to the military representative and whispered a few words in his ear. The military representative's eyes lit up, and he immediately stood up. Saying to Francis, "Excuse me, sir, I need to take this call." Francis keenly sensed that things had changed, and were developing in a negative direction. What could it be? Just as he was wondering, a servant hurriedly pushed open the door and leaned close to Francis, saying, Mr. Grevy has instructed that 5,000 francs be paid immediately, and the contract be signed right away. Immediately, Francis's expression changed. Things might be worse than he had imagined. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.